Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. Jorn Barradell, who assumed the role of London Local Authority Gold a few days after the fire.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Willett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. I now call Mr. Jorn Barradell, please.
Good morning, Mr. Barradell.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to take the oath.
That's right.
There should be a testament on the desk next to you. Have you got it there?
I do.
That's it. You can take that in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen in front of you.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Do sit down, please, and make yourself comfortable. Right. Good. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Willett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Barradell, good morning.
Good morning.
Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and helping us with our investigations? We are very grateful to you. Just a few introductory matters first. Can I ask you please to keep your voice up so that the transcriber who sits to your right can get down everything you say clearly and cleanly? It helps also, please, not to nod or shake your head. You have to say yes or no, as the case may be, otherwise it doesn't come out on the transcript. We'll be taking breaks during the course of the day, morning and afternoon, but other than that, if you feel you need to take a break, then we can take a brief break as well.
Thank you.
I will be asking you a number of questions based on the documents that we have, which will appear on the screen in front of you. So everything I'm asking you about will appear there for you. If you'd like me to repeat the question or put the question in a different way, then I can do that.
Thank you.
I'd like, first of all, please, to show you your witness statements. You've provided two witness statements to the inquiry. First, please, GOL 50244. Is that your first statement to the inquiry, dated the 1st of February 2019?
Yes, it is.
And can we go, please, to page 13? You'll see a signature there. Is that your signature?
It is.
And if we can go, please, next to GOL 401706. We find your second statement, dated the 3rd of August 2020. Is that your second statement?
It is.
Can we please go to page 23? You'll see a signature there above the date of the 3rd of August. Is that your signature?
Well, that is.
And have you read both of these statements recently?
Yes, I have.
And can you confirm, please, that their contents are true?
They are.
Now, I'm going to start with your background and your roles. Is it right that you are the Town Clerk and Chief Executive of the City of London Corporation?
Yes, I am.
And I think you've occupied that post since September 2012.
That's right.
And in addition, you have what is called a lead role, is that right, in the wider London Resilience arrangements?
Yes, I do.
And that includes being the Deputy Chair of the London Resilience Forum, or LRF, yes?
That's right.
Yes. And the LRF, I think, as we've heard from other witnesses, sets the strategy and the objectives for the London Resilience Partnership, or the LRP. Yes?
That's right.
Yes, and that partnership isn't a legal partnership. It's I think, is this right, an umbrella or overarching organisation bringing together some 170 underlying organisations, yes?
Yes, I can't answer for the exact number, but it is a significant number of organisations.
Yes, and they each have specific responsibilities for preparing for and responding to emergencies.
Yes, they do.
Now, in your first statement, we don't need to turn to this. Well, let's turn to it and let's look at it. It's GOL 50244, page 2. In paragraph 10, but let's go to page 3 is the best place to pick it up. Page 10, you explain that the LRF sets the strategy, and that includes making plans for London's preparedness in the event of emergencies affecting communities. And then you give some examples: water shortage, flooding due to major incidents with significant loss of life. And then you say the forum agrees a number of multi-agency plans directed at identified risks and sets out platforms for collaboration. And then you go on to list those plans at paragraph 11, and you say that they are set out, the plans are set out in, and let's read it together, London Resilience Partnership multi-agency plans, frameworks and protocols, which include the Strategic Coordination Protocol, Recovery Management Protocol, Humanitarian Assistance Framework, Communicating with the Public Framework, and the Mass Fatalities Framework, Structural Collapse Framework, and the Scientific and Technical Advice Cell, STAC, arrangements, Each of these protocols and plans were relevant to the actions undertaken during the relevant period from 14th June 2017 to 20th June 2017. These plans, frameworks and protocols are underpinned by the London Emergency Services Liaison Panel, LESLP, the Major Incident Procedure Manual, and the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles, GESIP, and are published and available on the public website of the London Resilience website, hosted by the Greater London Authority, GLA. Now, I read that out to you in order to give people and remind you perhaps of the range and complexity of the arrangements underpinning the LRP plans. Looking at it in a little bit more detail, can you confirm for us that the London Resilience Forum, LRF, is split up into sector panels?
It is, yes.
And they represent the interests of different sectors, yes?
Yes.
And that includes the LAP, or Local Authorities Panel, yes?
That's right.
And I think you were chair of at the time, and are still chair.
I was at the time. I'm no longer the chair.
Right. And when did you cease being the chair?
I believe about 6 to 8 months ago.
Right. And when did you become chair?
Around 2014, I believe.
And if we go on to paragraph 12 of your statement, if we scroll down, please, on page 3, you say, my role as deputy chair of the LRF is directly attributable to the lead role on resilience I perform on behalf of all other London chief executives. And by doing so, I chair the local authorities panel. The role of the panel is, and then you set it out, first bullet, to provide a strategic overview to local authority civil resilience activity and assurance in London. Second bullet, to develop strategy for local authority issues, to ensure a fully integrated and coordinated approach to pan-London working, including local authority participation in London Resilience Partnership activities, and then London local authority gold arrangements. And then over the page, strategic direction to the LAP implementation group, which we've heard about, a steering group for all support funded and provided centrally through the LRG, etc., and then Central Resilience Fund, strategic issues, consideration of reports and communication with other LRF subcommittees, and in the last bullet point there, to promote a fully integrated and coordinated approach to cross-agency working and to maintain effective interagency communication. Now, again, I show you that in order to perhaps demonstrate for everybody the range and complexity of the role that you occupied. Is that fair?
It is. Could I take you back a page? Sorry, Mr.
Yes, go to page 3. Is there something you want?
There is, subsequent to my signing the statement, in terms of the London Resilience Partnership, I have been asked by the chair to continue to serve as deputy chair despite no longer chairing the local authorities panel.
Thank you. Now, we understand that in June 2017, David Kerry, who was RBKC's contingency planning manager, was the practitioner advisor to you as chair of the LAP. Is that right?
Yes, he was.
What was the extent of the engagement that you had with David Kerry in that role before the 14th of June 2017?
It would only have been at local authority panel meetings. The key contact point and advice would have come from Mark Sawyer.
Mark Sawyer. And what was your experience of David Kerry and his performance as a practitioner advisor?
He seemed to me to be quite competent as an emergency planning officer, and certainly, in my view, had an understanding and a leadership role, which I believed he fulfilled well, of chairing that local implementation group.
Did you ever see him in action in an emergency?
Not during an emergency, as far as I recall.
Did you ever study closely RBKC's contingency management plans?
No, I wouldn't, and there'd be no reason for me to do so as far as I was.
Now, you were, at least, at the time, I think, a standing member of the Chief Executives of London Councils Group, or CELC. Is that correct?
It is. All 33 chiefs are members of that group.
Yes, and I think, am I right in asking you this, that the CELC is a representative body seeking to promote the interests of London's 33 local authorities, among others?
It is.
Thank you. Now, am I also right that John O'Brien was the Chief Executive of London Councils in June 2017?
Yes, he was.
And how does that role differ from the Chief Executive of London Councils, CELC?
So John O'Brien was Chief Exec of the representative body of the councils themselves, so that was the elected members and the councils as corporate entities. The CELC is the body which comprises of the chief executives of each of the London local authorities, plus myself as town clerk of the city. We meet every month and we discuss issues of relevance to the chief executives of London councils.
Right. So the CELC is essentially a council of 33 of the of the 33 chief executives.
Correct.
And does that and that has a chair, does it?
It does.
And who was that?
I can't recall who it was at the time. It may have been Leslie Seary, if my memory is correct.
Right, but not John O'Brien. There's no overlap there.
No, he is a member of CELC or attends CELC. Sorry, of another acronym, the Chief Executives of London Councils. But I don't believe he was a standing member or a chair of CELC. I could be wrong. He may have been a member, but certainly didn't chair it.
Right, and just exploring that a little bit more,
Yep.
You've got two bodies, it seems.
Yep.
You've got the London councils,
Yep.
and you've got CELC, and CELC simply being the collection of chief executives of the London councils.
Yes.
Are both of them creations of the contingency regime, civil contingency regime?
No, they're not of themselves.
Does that explain why there are two of them?
I think it's more about the agendas for CELC, the Chief Executives Forum, would be specific to chief executives and their executive function. London Councils is a representative body of the leaders of and other elected members of the individual councils that come together to form policy on multiple areas, housing, a lot of other areas, for an example.
Yes. Then let's turn next to the role of London Local Authority Gold. Now, am I right in asking you that stems from an agreement between all 33 London local authorities called the Gold Resolution?
It does, as amended.
As
after it was
amended,
created.
and it does because it originated before 2011 and was amended in 2011.
That's my understanding.
Right. And does that permit a nominated chief executive, known I think as LLAG, London Local Authority Gold, to commit resources and expenditure on behalf of all local authorities in the event of an emergency falling within the civil contingencies regime?
And within the construct of the resolution itself, yes.
And within the construct, what do you mean by that?
That is about the activation process, procedure, and also the kind of emergencies as declared, as to whether then that resolution would be invoked or not.
Well, we're going to... Right, I think I understand. Well, we'll explore that in a little bit more detail. Is LLAG a role recognised or authorised by the primary legislation, the CCA?
I'm not sure of the answer to that. I believe it's a construct of London local government.
Right. You say a construct of London local government.
Correct.
Does that mean it has its origins or underpinnings in law, to the best of your understanding, or by arrangement or agreement or practice?
I believe it's facilitated or allowed for under the Local Government Act, but of itself, the resolution is one that was constructed for London's specific circumstances of 33 sovereign local authorities that would come together to be able to respond to and address a particular emergency and spend cash and spend money and resources of those authorities.
And to the best of your knowledge, do other large conurbations in the United Kingdom have something similar?
I believe most of the large conurbations do not have the structure of London local government. They either have unitary authorities responsible for the entire area, or county councils, again, having that responsibility for civil contingencies.
Now, am I right also in thinking that the arrangements being underpinned by the resolution were also underpinned by the London Local Authority's MOU, ratified in July 2011?
Yes, there were parallel documents and parallel, if you will,
Yes.
how would I put this? Parallel documents to support that resolution, yes.
And that would include the CE circular, the Chief Executive Circular.
Yes, it would.
Yes. Is it right that you've performed the role of London Local Authority Gold, LLAG, in a number of incidents before June 2014?
Either incidents or I've supported London Local Authority Gold. Specific, if I can be specific, if it would be helpful.
Please.
So things like the Alexander Litvinenko incident, I was not London Local Authority Gold. I was responsible for the delivery of the recovery of that incident, for an example. That wasn't acting as London Local Authority Gold.
Was it your understanding in June 2017 that, well, let me try it slightly differently. What was your understanding in June 2017 of the applicability of the Gold Resolution in an incident where a local authority has not sought the assistance of LLAG?
There was no facility for an external body or an individual to invoke the arrangements. That was a responsibility and could only be done by the authority having the incident within their borders.
So there was no power, is this right, for a London local authority goal to intervene unilaterally in the event of an emergency within a local authority's borders where no request for assistance was made by that local authority?
That is absolutely correct.
And what about where the incident spilled over into a neighbouring borough?
Then the facility again could be invoked.
But only by
conversation, by a discussion between authorities.
Right.
There was far more ability to invoke that resolution if it was across border or pan London than there was if the incident happened within a single borough.
And is it right that as of June 2017 there was no formal recognised trigger or procedure or mechanism for activating LLAG?
Correct.
And was there any commonly shared understanding among councils about at what stage an incident should reach before London Goal should be invited to intervene?
If the incident required the establishment of a strategic coordinating group, which is, I think, the inquiry's heard before about the acronym and what that means,
yes,
then there would be attendance of the on-call London Local Authority Gold or their deputy, depending on circumstances, supported by the London Resilience team.
Now, would an SCG be required once a major incident as defined in the LASLP, for example,
Yes,
was declared by any one of the blue light services?
or any of the Category 1 responders.
Or
yes.
any Category 1 responder?
Correct.
And the attendance at the SCG of the duty LLAG would be presumably, is this right, in a capacity of support and information gathering, but not to take over?
Correct. Correct.
Right.
Although, if the incident had been multi-borough, for an example, or spanned across multiple boroughs, the expectation would be that would be the lead chief executive at that call, representing local authorities in the round. The arrangements are, and the implementation of those arrangements are different if it spans more than one borough.
And the lead chief executive representing local authorities in the round, would that be the chairman of the CELC, or would it be the chief executive of London councils?
In that case, it would be the chief executive on the rota of chief executives as London Local Authority Gold.
That would be the duty LLAG?
Correct. He would
Right.
be the person, or she would be the person who attended those meetings.
Right, I see. But only where it was multi-borough?
Correct. Although, if an SCG is called, it would be good practice for whoever was on call Local Authority Gold to be present as part of the process to understand what was going on in an incident where they may be called later on to support the individual boroughs.
Yes. And is it the case, just following on from that, that, as I think you've just explained, there was a rota where 24 hours a day a nominated chief executive, one of the 33,
Yep,
would be on call as a duty LLAG?
They would, along with a second person who was called the secondary, who would be available should there be more than one incident, or the primary person would be unavailable, sick, or whatever.
Yes. And I think it's the case, as we've heard from earlier witnesses, that in your first year as chief executive, you would not be on the rota.
Typically not, unless you had specific experience already gained. We have examples of chief executives who've been serving in one borough and reappeared as the chief executive in another borough later on. If they had the experience, the training and so on, then yes, they would be asked to go onto the rota.
And in general terms, what would be the role of, as of June 2017, of the duty LLAG in an emergency such as the Grenfell Tower fire, before the Gold Resolution was formally activated?
Attendance at the Strategic Coordinating Group to keep a watching, it's a horrible term, but a watching brief on what was happening, to make sure they understood what the situation was on the ground and what likely support may be asked for of local authorities across London.
And would that duty LLAG attending the SCGs in a watching role report to anybody in the LLAG or London chief executives' frameworks?
There isn't. The practice normally held was that yes, there would be information from that person to other interested chief executives, including the chair of the local authorities panel. That would be simply to make sure individuals were briefed and understood the position, again, should additional resource or support be needed. There was no formality in that arrangement. It was practice that took place.
And what would happen if the attending duty LLAG, attending an SCG meeting, perceived that the relevant local authority needed more support, or needed to call on mutual aid arrangements, or needed to invoke LLAG Gold, but wasn't doing so?
I would have expected them to have talked to the local authority panel chief and other chief executives.
With a view to doing what?
With a view, first of all, to understanding what was going on, to give a view on the reason for that view, as it were, and thirdly, I believe, to ensure that they understood the severity of the position and to encourage the chief executive to invoke or to ask for that support.
Right. So it would be, as you say, encouragement rather than...
There was no direction available to anyone. This is to speak to colleagues, to encourage them that there is support available, and please people are available to step forward to assist.
Yes, was there an expectation that the chief executive of the relevant borough where the emergency had occurred would consult with the duty LLAG before activating or considering activating the gold resolution?
Yeah, again, that would be good practice for clear reasons, actually, to understand what support would be available, how they'd be able to get that support into the borough to assist them.
Now, we're going to come to the activation and the facts surrounding it later in your evidence, Mr. Barradell, but let me ask you one or two primordial questions. First, was it your understanding at the time that the LLAG, once the gold resolution had been activated, took over, or did they merely cooperate with the chief executive of the local authority?
It is designed to support the chief executive. If I can assist to the inquiry with this for clarity. So the role of the local government, the local authority gold, the London local authority gold, was to support but not take over or run the response in a borough. And by way of analogy, if I could, if we consider Mr. Holgate, Nicholas Holgate, as being the RBKC gold for this, if the inquiry understand the term, I believe it's been used before, the role of London Local Authority Gold with Nicholas Holgate would be to be with him, to support him in organisation, understanding resources available, to advise him as he chaired the Gold Group meetings of what was available. That's the role of London Local Authority Gold with RBKC.
Now, breaking that up a little bit, you say support and advise. Was that, I want just to try to get an idea of what that really means.
Yeah.
Was that words of encouragement, physical presence, emotional support, strategic support, or was it the provision of people and money, space?
It would not be the latter until the person took over the RBKC role as gold. It would be about coordination, understanding facilities and support available, coordinating that into the effort, but the chairing of the response would be RBKC Gold.
Right. Now, you say in that last answer, it would not be the latter until the person took over the RBKC role as gold. When would that happen?
In this incident, to be clear, it would happen when asked for by Nicholas Holgate.
Right. Now, whether or not asked for or imposed, leave that on one side for the moment. Was it the case, to your understanding at the time, that once LLAG was activated, then the LLAG person, in this case it was you, took over and no longer supported but actually occupied the role of gold previously occupied by Nicholas Holgate? Absolutely
not.
So what was it?
It was a specific request by Nicholas to chair the RBKC Gold meetings, not simply to activate London Local Authority Gold within his borough.
When you say take over, what is it that LLAG was to take over?
At 2:00, it was chairing RBKC Gold and be responsible for the response to the Grenfell fire within RBKC.
So did you was it your understanding, and perhaps leave the incident aside for a moment, was it your understanding that once the LLAG resolution had been activated and was in practice, then the LLAG person stood in the shoes of the chief executive?
They stood by them, not in their shoes. And I think it's also important to recognise that these arrangements were never designed for the circumstances of Grenfell, where we had a local authority and a chief executive who did not actively request or receive, because they had not requested or allowed support to be given. This was a unique circumstance.
But you say, in the last answer but one, that the role was to chair RBKC Gold and be responsible for the response to the Grenfell Tower fire.
That's not LLAG's role. That is RBKC Gold's role, one that I took at 2:00 in the afternoon. And that is not framed by any previous agreement that was in situ at the time. This was a direct response to the circumstances of the Grenfell fire recovery.
I just want to get a handle on what's normal. In a normal case where LLAG is activated, assume it to be at the request of the local authority Gold, upon activation, would LLAG continue to provide support, standing next to the local authority chief executive, or would LLAG assume the role and responsibilities of the local authority chief executive in a normal case contemplated by the arrangements?
As contemplated, stand next to, not in the shoes of, is the best explanation I can give. They were providing support, not running or taking over. Each of the boroughs is sovereign. There's no facility for someone, I think, apart from government probably, to step into a local authority and direct. The facility simply isn't there to do that.
Right. Okay. And
unless requested by that local authority.
And at the stage when local authority Gold is activated in the normal case, is it at that stage that LLAG provides money, people, and, if necessary, space?
On the standing by would include coordination and whatever support would be asked for or needed or recommended by the person, by RBKC Gold in this circumstance.
So your evidence is that even upon activation in the normal case, LLAG Gold would be reactive and would provide or seek to provide whatever support in terms of people, money and space that it was asked for?
I think it would be not reactive, it would be proactive in suggesting to and providing, if you will, the more experienced support to the person responsible for the response. I think reactive, it gives the wrong impression. I would expect in that circumstance someone to be offering support, offering advice on what and how to ask for, and also offering advice on what was available from other local authorities to assist in that response.
And how did that, in the normal case, differ from the position before activation?
It would be the person physically next to, within the SCG meetings, attending the Gold meetings, and having the ability to stand next to, and I mean that literally as well as metaphorically, stand next to the person doing that response with that specific responsibility, the Gold, in our case, the RBKC Gold.
And what did you understand to be the source of LLAG's powers and authority to act once the LLAG resolution was activated?
It's within the resolution itself, if we're talking of the stand next to piece. It's within the resolution.
That's limited to spending money?
It's limited to spending money and also coordinating the response and helping understand what facilities are available. It would be good practice to do it. You would want to offer that support to a colleague who was trying to deal with an incident.
So if I can just make sure I've understood all this. Once the Gold resolution is activated, the LLAG would, for example, attend meetings of the Borough Gold Committee and, as you say, literally stand or sit next to the chief executive, giving him advice and support, but not chairing the meeting.
Correct, sir.
And not taking any decisions as a result of the meeting if there were decisions to be taken.
Correct.
So that's the paradigm arrangement, is that right?
That's right. Hence my comment around standing next to as opposed to in the shoes of.
Quite. Good. And then I'm sure in a moment you're going to be asked what happened in this case. But
Yes.
on you go, Mr. Phillips.
Yes, thank you. Can we go, please, then, to 14th of June, GOL 50165. And what we have here is an email from Matt Hogan at 04:38 in the morning of the 14th of June 2017 to Chris Naylor, who was the shortly to be incoming duty LLAG from Barking and Dagenham. A copy to you. Declared major incident, Grenfell Tower, North Kensington, red category. And I think this is a standard message, isn't it, that gets sent by the LACC duty manager, who was Matt Hogan, to the next day's duty LLAG and his or her deputy. Yes?
Yes, I'm not sure there's a template, but it's the kind of information that would be shared if there was an incident declared, yes.
Yes. I think you were, as you tell us in your statement, first informed of the fire at 04:37 via an email from London Resilience, which I think we see just below here, actually, because this comes to you, yes?
The one
you say 4:37, it's actually 4:38, but I don't think anything turns on that. And the template, if we scroll down, it comes on the 13th of June. If you look at that, lower down the screen.
Yes.
Dear Chris, LLAG, and Paul, Deputy, I'm the on-call duty LLAC manager from 9 o'clock tomorrow. If you need to activate, please use the following means to contact the duty manager. Now, that must have been a standard, mustn't it?
Sorry, that one is, yes. Yeah. The actual information on activation, I don't believe, is a standard.
Yes. Now, you were, I think, informed of the fire by the top email, and as you look at it, at the last paragraph, you can just see it on your screen. It says, an SCG teleconference has been requested by LFB and will take place at 0500 hours. Yes?
Yes.
And we'll see that you were included in subsequent updates on the 14th of June. Yes. And before we look at these, let me ask you, what was your role, if any, at that moment, 4:38 on the 14th of June?
Chair of the local authorities panel.
Right. And would it be normal for you to be copied into an alert like this?
Yes, it would.
Right.
I would hope it would, yes.
Yes. And you would, I think, as you say, be involved frequently in senior level conference calls with chief executives to provide peer support.
Yes. If I was available, I would do that.
Yeah. Now, the on-duty LLAG that night was Andrew Blake Herbert, who was chief executive of the London Borough of Havering. And he was on duty till 9 a.m.
Yeah.
And I think it's the case that he couldn't attend the first SCG at 5 a.m. And Mark Sawyer did so on his behalf. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that. Right. Yeah. Would seem reasonable to me.
And is it right that Mark Sawyer was the chief executive liaison officer?
Yes. Yes, he was.
For resilience. Now, it is also the case, as we've established, I think, from the material, that Nicholas Holgate was also not at the 5 a.m. SCG. My question is, would the duty LLAG and the chief executive of a local authority normally have provided or been present to provide important insight from their own experience about a borough's capability beyond that which Mark Sawyer could have provided?
I would have expected them to be able to do, if they possibly could, to have been on that call, yes.
Yes. And similarly, Nicholas Holgate didn't attend the 6:30 SCG meeting either, which was the next one after the 5 a.m. meeting. Would you have expected the chief executive to have attended both meetings?
I would have, yes, I would. With the incident of this magnitude, yes, I would.
And in relation to continuing representation by the LLAG at SCG meetings, we've seen evidence or documents which indicate that Mark Sawyer and both the LLAGs, Andrew Blake Herbert and Chris Naylor, did not attend the subsequent SCG meetings at 6:30, 8:30, 1400 and 19:30 on the 14th of June. But first, were you aware of that?
I can't say I was, no.
Right. Would it be normal for none of those individuals to have attended?
I am surprised that not one of them attended an SCG.
Right. Now let's go to LFB 0006117, please. LFB 0006117. This is the 5 a.m. SCG minute. And if we go, please, to that's it. This is now an email run, and if we go to the foot of page 1, after the minute, this is an email, the foot of page 1 and over to 2, from Toby Gould, who was at London Fire, to Nicholas Holgate and Andrew Blake Herbert, who at that point, 0744, was still the on-call duty LLAG, with Chris Naylor also receiving this email. He was incoming at 9 a.m., copy to David Kerry and John Hetherington. And if we go over the page, I tried to call, but appreciate you're very busy. I understand you spoke to Matthew Hogan from our team earlier this morning and confirmed you were content for Kensington and Chelsea to participate in the SCG meetings / teleconferences. Please let me know if that position changes and you feel there would be benefit in London Local Authority Gold participation to lead on any pan-London issues. I'm not aware of any at present, given the scene is contained within Kensington and Chelsea. And then we are standing up people to staff the London Local Authority Coordination Centre to assist in coordinating local authority support should that be required. I understand Hammersmith and Fulham have already spoken to David Kerry with an offer of support. Now, was there a view, do you recall, that because this incident was self-contained within RBKC's boundaries, that it was for RBKC to lead and indicate that they would need further support if they felt necessary?
I think the first part is clearly yes. My expectation would be RBKC would lead the response and absolutely would expect them to need support from other London boroughs. It was evident at the time that this was a catastrophe of a scale that an individual borough I would have expected, whichever borough in London, would have needed the support of other colleagues in the recovery period, if not immediately, although I think they would have done immediately, certainly in the hours and days afterwards.
Now, this is, of course, as I've shown you early in the morning, it's that this email goes at 0744, but even at that point, ought there to have been representation by the LLAG or Gs at those SCG meetings at that time?
I would have thought so if they had seen the scale of the incident that was being dealt with. You would need to ask them what their availability or presence and where they physically were, but I would have expected one of them to attend. And certainly one of their representatives, if they weren't able to themselves, to attend on their behalf and to be asked what was going on.
Yes, and would it follow from that, as you've just said, that there would be the benefits of continuity of representation at a strategic level?
Yes, I mean, there is clearly always a benefit in having a team around with resilience in the team. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, but also a need, and this would have come out, I think, of some of the earlier exercises, such as Exercise Unified Response, of a continuity of representation at the SCGs.
Yes, I think continuity is partly provided by if I can put them as a full-time staff here, but again, given the scale, I would have expected one of them to attend.
Let's then go to LFB 000061217, page 1, so further up the screen on page 1, where we can see an email from Holgate to Toby Gould at 7:50, a few minutes later. Toby, thanks. Aside from housing needs that may well spill over borough boundaries, I do not, brackets, think LLAG needs to gear up. And at the top of the chain, if you go to the very top of the screen, John Hetherington to you, copy to John O'Brien, where he forwards this email. Good morning, John. He says, just for information, we've been in touch with both Nicholas Holgate, Chris Naylor as oncoming LLAG, and Andrew Blake Herbert as offgoing LLAG. All are content at the moment that RBKC retained the lead at this point. The LLACC is opening to support K&C should they need mutual aid, and we are in contact with PHE and Fiona Wilcox regarding support to stack and mass FATS coordination. All boroughs have been made aware, but no requests for mutual aid yet, or other issues raised by other boroughs. Next SCG at 8:30. And as you see, you're copied in on that chain. Now, having received that email and the emails below it forwarded to you, setting out Nicholas Holgate's view at the time, do you do yourself form your own view of whether London Local Authority Gold needed to gear up?
This provided a degree of reassurance that, in retrospect, was badly misplaced, actually. And that was that the statement, all are content at the moment that RBKC retained the lead at this point, and then that boroughs made aware but no request for mutual aid yet, or other issues from the borough. In retrospect, that clearly was not the case. At the time, I took some degree of comfort that these individuals had checked and that they were quite content that RBKC kept the lead.
You say in retrospect. What is it that you found out later that you didn't know at the time?
Looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, looking now, it was clearly not the case that RBKC did not accept. It was wrong not to have accepted support at that early stage, nor indeed to look for support around the lead. This was clearly a significant, major incident that required a very different level of intervention and support than was evident or was projected at 8:10 in the morning.
Well, I ask again, what was it that you learnt later that you didn't know at that moment?
That support had been offered and not accepted, number one. Number two, that the degree of confidence and, bluntly, ability of those running this in RBKC was not there.
Now, I think it's right, just confirmed for me, that during the morning and early afternoon of the 14th of June 2017, you had yourself no contact with either of the duty LLAGs or John O'Brien or Nicholas Holgate.
Yes, the 14th, I was unfortunately engaged in some work in the corporation of interviewing candidates.
I see. During the course of that day, were you involved at all in the response to the Grenfell Tower fire?
During the day, I don't believe so, no.
Right. Now, we know that there was a Cross-Whitehall ministerial meeting at 4 p.m, 1600 hours on that day, and RBKC were invited to attend. Let's go to GOL 50159, please. This is an update from John Hetherington at 1426. It's sent to Chris, which is Chris Naylor from John Hetherington. Good afternoon, Chris. The fire has not yet been extinguished, etc. And then there's some details about SCGs, and then fatalities, casualties, and then about third of the way down your screen. Cordons remain in place surrounding the site. Initial inspections have reported the building is intact. RBKC have opened a number of reception centres and a friends and family centre for this, looking for people involved in the incident, support from LBHF, etc. And the last line, at present they are managing with demands and assessing the exact need for support. And then there's the reference to the Cross-Whitehall meeting at 1600 hours, which Nicholas will be on the call to represent local government. And it continues in that vein. You get this email at 1431 by way of Chris Naylor sending it to you by copy in his response to John Hetherington. John, thank you very much, appreciated. Chris, did you see this email at the time?
It may not have been at 2:31. I may have been interviewing. I don't recall exactly when it was, but I was, as I say, interviewing during the course of that day.
Right. Now, to cut a long story short to some extent, it turned out that Nicholas Holgate was not added to the conference call because of an administrative error, so he didn't attend the Cross-Whitehall 1600 hours meeting. Would it have been beneficial to have him there at that meeting?
Absolutely.
And would it have been beneficial to have had London Gold attendance at that meeting?
Yes, I believe it would.
And given the nature and the seriousness of the incident, would you have expected Chris Naylor to have received an invitation to attend that meeting?
I don't know whether I would have expected it at the time, but self-evidently it would have been of benefit for him to have been on that call.
Right. He wasn't, at least according to the list of attendees at CAB 402711, which we don't need to go to, but would you have expected the Cabinet Office or the DCLG-RED to have invited the duty LLAG to that meeting?
If they knew that that person existed, which would be a function, I think, of the Resilience and Emergencies Direct staff at the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. In other words, if they realised that there was someone called the London Local Authority Gold with that remit and expertise, then I would have expected them to be invited. It would seem self-evident to me they ought to have been.
Right. That's a fairly major contingency,
Yeah.
your if. I mean, is there any reason why central government, whether it's the Cabinet Office or the lead department, would not know of the existence of something called London Local Authority Gold?
One would have expected someone to have done so who was involved in that call.
Well, you say one would have expected. Is that delicate and polite?
I have been called polite in this before. I am surprised that they weren't. If they weren't aware, I'd be very surprised, because they should have been aware of the arrangements of the capital city and how it was organised for resilience and emergencies.
And would you have expected, had Chris Naylor been invited, would you have expected him to have provided a blunt and candid assessment, not only of the position on the ground, but the capabilities of RBKC in managing the response?
As far as he was aware at the time, yes. I always find that in these circumstances, with this kind of the experience I've had, that you have to be clear, concise, hope I am being this morning, and direct in the answers that you give and the information that you provide.
Let's then turn to the 17:30 telephone conference with Nicholas Holgate. Can we go to GOL 401349? Statement of Mark Sawyer. As you've told us, he was the Chief Executive Liaison Resilience Officer. I won't anachronise that at the time. If we go please to page 6, paragraph 30, he says this. It's quite long, but let me show you the first half. Following notification at 0441 on the 14th of June 2017, my role was to monitor the regional local authority response on behalf of the local authorities panel and provide support and advice as necessary to Jorn Barradell in his capacity as the chair of the local authorities panel and other local authority chief executives. My initial action was to review the names of local authority officers included in the initial notification email sent by Matthew Hogan to ensure the correct people have been included. Is that correct, first of all?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
Yes. And then if you go to paragraph 34 on page 7, please, next page, we scroll down to the very foot, you can see the question. Yep. Question 9, foot of page 7. Details of communications you had with, and then top of page 8. And you can then see a list of people, including primary duty LLAG before and after 9 a.m. and your name there as well. And then if you go down, please, to paragraph 30. Well, I think we need to go back to paragraph 34. Yes. He says, as the day progressed and following a conversation with Jorn Barradell, I was asked to liaise with London Resilience Group to set up a conference call involving Nicholas Holgate, Chris Naylor as LLAG, John O'Brien, the Chief Executive of London Councils, and John Barradell. John Hetherington, Deputy Head London Resilience, set up the conference call for 17:30. For details of the call and outcomes, please see paragraphs 41, 42 and 43. Now, do you know what prompted the need for that call at that time?
If I recollect correctly, it was to make sure that Nicholas Holgate understood the offers being made to him and to check whether he believed he had the support he needed.
Now, let's look and see what Mark Sawyer told us yesterday. Yep. Can we please go to the transcript of day 278, page 101? And if we pick it up at line 18, he's asked by counsel, Mr. Keating, you mentioned how concerns emerged in the afternoon. Can you tell us when that was and what were the nature of those concerns? Answer, I don't know precise timings. Question, yes. Answer, but I think there were two areas of concern. One was the rising media coverage, and some of the stories that were starting to be aired didn't quite match with, turn the page, sort of information that we were had received previously in the day. And I think Jorn Barradell may be able to add more to this, but I think he was aware of lots of offers of support and help being declined or not being taken up. And so really it was just something that needed to happen to just sense check the situation within the borough, and something that, Jorn Barradell, as chair of the local authorities panel, would inevitably have wanted to do. Now, looking at the lines where he says at 3, I think he was aware of lots of offers of support and help being declined or not being taken up. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. And was it that what prompted the call?
One of the prompts, yeah.
Right. And what was the purpose of that call?
At the time, to understand the situation, as I've said, of RBKC and their response. And one of the items would have been checking why some of those offers hadn't been taken up. If I can refer, for an example, to the city's own position here, because I believe my head of emergency planning much earlier in the day had pointed out that the city had made offers to RBKC, and there was no note back to me to say those offers had been accepted.
Yes. And in what capacity were you attending this meeting? Was it as peer support or deputy chair of the LAP or
chair of the local authorities panel?
Chair of the LAP,
yes.
But not you weren't on the LLAG rota.
No.
So your role was what? Informal?
More informal, but I hate the phrase, but I have experience of this kind of work in terms of coordinating responses to emergencies, and I would wish to have provided support both to the London Local Authority Gold and to Nicholas Holgate, right, and offer what support I could to them.
Were you aware at that time, when this was set up, of the media reports now beginning to come in about the fire and RBKC's response to it?
I was away during the day, but I think it was certainly the kind of thing that would have been raised with me by Mark and others.
Right. And to your way of thinking, was it becoming ripe now for an LLAG activation?
It was surprising to me that offers of support would be turned down by any borough in an incident of this kind. And I would have expected a far more formal request for support from the leadership on that borough.
And what was it about the response at that time, late afternoon on the 14th, that meant that you expected a more formal request from the leadership?
Frankly, the scale of the incident, as I've said in the early morning, was such that it would be self-evident, I would have thought. It was self-evident to me that we would be asking for a lot of support from other boroughs during the course of the next hours or next few days.
If we now go to GOL 50155, here we see the invitation email from John Hetherington at 16:10, and he says that the teleconference has been organised for 17:30 today. And just before we get to the text, look at the attendees. There's Nicholas Holgate, Chris Naylor, you, John O'Brien, John Hetherington and Mark Sawyer. Plus, in fact, I think Eleanor Kelly, because as she has told us in her statement, she was in your office and on the call. Do you remember her being on that call?
Yes, I remember that.
You do. So, in fact, 7 attendees in all. And you can see the purpose from the top paragraph: to discuss the local government ongoing support to the Grenfell Tower incident. The purpose of the call is to understand the likely support that RBKC will require and how this can be best supported across local government, and in particular strategic support to Nicholas. Secondly, to consider the wider implications for RBKC and London and what initial actions are required. And then you can see the agenda items below that. And below the list, agenda items: significant changes to the situation overview, immediate and longer term support requirements for RBKC, wider London implications. Now, did you make any personal notes or logs during this meeting?
Sadly not.
And by this point, would you agree that the incident was sufficiently serious such that senior individuals were conducting this call? Does that explain why this cast was on the call?
I think it's evidence of the impact of the event, the size of the event, and the concern of colleagues as to how they could help and what they could do.
Now, you say sadly no to the meeting. Was it standard practice not to have a meeting note before formal activation of LLAG?
It would be surprising. It would be unusual, and I don't know of another circumstance where there hasn't been a document that has said or has noted the fact that the activation would take place.
And is that because there was no provision for an official logist before activation?
In this circumstance, there was not, no.
Well, there wasn't one, but was there a provision? Was the provision for a logist one which only took over once LLAG had been invoked?
I'm not, bluntly, once it's invoked, the Gold should have their own logist to do three things, really. One is to track the information and data that the individual was aware of at the time. The second one, to document the actions that were taken as a result of that data. And the third one, to make sure that the rationale for that decision had been captured as well. So it was very clear, it was very clear as an audit trail of actions taken, decisions taken, and how they were frankly arrived at.
Now, instead, we have John Hetherington's précis of the meeting, which we can go to next. It's at GOL 50181. We've seen it at other references, but here it is there. It's an email sent by John Hetherington at 18:59 on the 14th of June to Nicholas Holgate, Chris Naylor, and you, John O'Brien, and Mark Sawyer. Good evening. A short précis of the earlier teleconference. And did you read this at the time, given your other activities?
I believe I'd finished the activities by that time. Right. The interviews, I think, finished late afternoon, if I recall correctly.
Right. And if we pick it up 5 lines down under the situation update, it says RBKC are continuing. Can you see?
Yes, I can.
RBKC are continuing to support those displaced from Grenfell Tower and vulnerable residents in the close proximity. They continue to make contact with all known residents and those believed to be affected by the incident. There is capacity within the current rest centres, and the Westway Centre will remain open overnight. The focus will switch to humanitarian assistance and the specialist local authority support needed. There have been numerous offers of support which have been gratefully received. At present, housing, social services and cleaning operations are at sufficient service levels. Now, does that accord first with your recollection?
Of the situation that was described back to us, yes.
Right. Would you accept that presents a relatively positive picture and suggests rather that all is in hand?
Yes, I would.
Can you explain why that is the case? Does that reflect the conversation?
It reflects the conversation, yes, and I think self-evidently that was incorrect.
Right.
But the picture being painted, it seems to me consistently, was that they had sufficient capacity, sufficient expertise, ability, and frankly activity to support the comment being made here that they were within their capability, within their capacity.
Can I just ask you, how far had you managed to catch up with unfolding events by, let's say, well, just before the telecon?
I was behind, so I think it's fair to say. Events had clearly been taking place during the 14th rapidly, not least in terms of public awareness of and the media reporting of the aftermath of the fire.
Well, that I'm sure had got going, so to speak. But I was thinking really that, I mean, we know that the fire really took hold in the very early hours of the morning. And you obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, formed the view that this was far too big a disaster for any one borough to cope with on its own. And I'm just wondering to what extent by 4 o'clock in the afternoon you were aware of the extent of the fire and the magnitude of the disaster.
I think I was aware of the extent of the fire because of media reports, for an example. But the work taking place in the borough at the time was that we were constantly being reassured that they had sufficient resource in situ to be able to deal and to cope with that humanitarian assistance.
Well, and the reason for my asking you the question, as you probably realise, is that my next question is, did you, in a sense, challenge Mr. Holgate on his view of whether he could cope?
No, I didn't to the degree I should have done. And I think one of the things we'd perhaps get on later is my one regret, or one of my regrets, if I put it that way, was that I accepted at face value what I was being told, which is self-evidently wrong.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Yes. Well, what flows from that then is why, given that the reason, or one of the reasons, as we've seen from Mr. Sawyer's evidence yesterday, was for the call was the refusal of assistance which was being offered. Given that RBKC, Nicholas Holgate, was refusing offers, and that had caused concern sufficient to have a very senior team meeting about it, why were you so accepting of what you were being told in the paragraphs in Mr. Hetherington's précis I've just read to you?
I think at the time, because I believed Kensington and Chelsea had a capable set of officers who understood what to do in circumstances like this, that there was a degree of reassurance from the technical advisor, I think, as you mentioned earlier, for the local authorities panel being based in Kensington and Chelsea, and that was patently wrong. What we did do during the call was to, if I call it shoehorn, I think that probably describes the phrase or describes what happened well, officers from Southwark who had experience, significant experience of the fire at Lakenhall House, and a communications team from the city who were clearly needed to make sure that there was that support available to K&C, as well as Mark going across as a technical expert in these arrangements to give a view from within RBKC itself. There was, it's fair to say, rising concern at the end of the 14th about the capability, but insufficient at that time to have, sadly, the direct conversation with Nicholas Holgate to invoke, to ask for assistance, to activate that support into the borough.
Right. So is it fair to say that from what you could see, Mr. Sawyer's concerns and your concerns arising from the refusal of assistance, which had prompted the meeting in the first place, had been assuaged by what you were being told by Mr. Holgate?
To a degree.
But if not completely, then why do we not see a reflection of scepticism here? Or is that just because it's a précis?
I think it's partly because it's a précis. And I think you see some degree of scepticism in asking for these individuals to go across into Kensington and Chelsea and shoehorn, as I said, if I can put it that way, in there. But also I think there was, and I think Kensington and Chelsea were a very confident council, and they projected competence, professionalism, ability that I think in retrospect clearly was not backed up by action or indeed how they behaved in the incident and the aftermath of it. And that's a very blunt thing to say. But I think in my judgment that I would stand by that judgment.
Now,
with the benefit of hindsight, sorry if I could say.
Of course. We've seen from the agenda, I didn't share it to you, but take it from me that it was scheduled to last 15 minutes. In the end, can you recall how long it lasted?
I can't recall.
You say in your statement at paragraph 31, and there's no need to go back to it, that the call was an extensive discussion of the various issues facing RBKC. Looking at this email précis, is this a complete, or relatively, reasonably complete record of what was discussed?
I think it gives the highlights, because we would have absolutely discussed the lessons learned from Lakenhall House, given that Eleanor, I believe, was on that call, and Eleanor was the chief executive, Eleanor was the chief executive at Southwark during the Lakenhall House fire. First-hand experience of the things that would be needed and the kind of activity that would be needed by a local authority at that time.
Right. And if we go back to the agenda, we can pick up the three items on the agenda in John Hetherington's 1609 email. Can we do that? At GOL 50155. You could see the 3 bullet points there. And the first one was significant changes to the situation overview and pan-London coordination structures in place. What were the significant changes to the situation overview?
I think that was what was evident from 2 areas. One was the media reporting of the Westway Centre and the other rest centres that have been set up, and their situation, as it were, with the giving by the public in a very public-spirited way of goods for people who were survivors or bereaved in the fire. And secondly, I think the position as outlined by the officers who, particularly John Hetherington and Mark Sawyer, who were at that call.
And what was discussed in relation to the pan-London coordination structures?
I don't recall the specifics of that. You'd need to look back at the notes if you could. And I could maybe it may prompt memory if you can put back the notes of that meeting.
And the second note, well, let's do that. Let's go back to the previous document then, which is the Précis, which is at GOL 50181. Can you tell us what in that was the discussion about the pan-London coordination structures?
So I think it's the final paragraph under the heading of immediate and longer-term support.
Right.
So London Resilience would work particularly around to ensure the right support to humanitarian assistance and recovery going forward. And then there's a subsequent note.
If we go back to the agenda, page 1, GOL 155, this is 50155, second agenda item was immediate and longer-term support requirements for RBK&C, Nicholas Holgate. What was Mr. Holgate's position in terms of the support that he felt RBKC required at that time?
If I recall correctly, it was still we are comfortable, capable, and we are able to run this. We don't need specific support at this time. There were no requests for support, as far as I recall, at that meeting. Again, you need to refer me back to the note of the meeting, but I don't believe there was any specific support requested, offered and shoehorned, but not necessarily requested.
Now, Chris Naylor has given us a statement. He was the duty LLAG who was on this call. Yep. GOL 401603, please. And if we can go in it to page 7, paragraph 15. The long paragraph. If we pick it up at the 4th line down, the meeting received a verbal situation update from Nicholas Holgate and LRF colleagues. This included details of the mutual aid that had been offered and received, and concluded with a view that housing, cleansing and social service support were all operating at sufficient levels. And he goes on, in addition to this, a number of questions and lines of inquiry were pursued as follows. I asked about the capacity of the RBKC communications and community engagement teams. It was clear that there was a significant media interest in the incident. Just pausing there, does that accord with your recollection?
It does, yes. And hence the offer of City of London communication staff to assist.
Yes, I see. And it goes on, there was also a risk of community tension. As a result of this discussion, Nicholas agreed to the offer of additional support from the Corporation of London. Is that correct?
That's right.
Similar questions were asked about support for RBKC's political leadership, particularly those on the front line of community engagement, media queries and relations with Whitehall. Just pausing there, does that accord with your recollection?
Again, it does from the second sentence, but subsequent sentence would allude to that.
Specialist support from Southwark was also offered and accepted. Again, does that accord with your...
It does, yes.
Yeah. The meeting also agreed with that Mark Sawyer, LRF, would visit RBKC the following morning, quotes, to detail out this support and provide initial support regarding structures, needs and experience of previous events, close quotes. Again, does that accord with your recollection?
It does, but I believe the Mark Sawyer offer was in a subsequent conversation, not part of that call. If my recollection may be wrong with this, but I thought that was a second call took place immediately after the first one. But the offer was made for those reasons anyway.
He then goes on, I took this to mean that Mark would critically appraise the sufficiency of resources in place to address the points we'd raised, particularly in relation to temporary housing, cleansing, social workers, communications and cohesion. Now, that was his understanding of what Mark Sawyer was intending. Was it yours?
It was. And also, if I could say about the structures, and Structures are very important in emergencies because they provide a framework within which people can request, ask, direct. Without the structures being sensible and robust, the likelihood of a response being frankly adequate is diminished significantly. So part of Mark's role was to provide assurance that the structures being put in place, and if you will, the frameworks, and I think you've seen a number of those earlier on described, that those frameworks were being implemented in a way that allowed the response to be robust, coherent, and frankly good.
Was it the case, as Nicholas Holgate has told us in his evidence on day 273 at page 118, that the activation of London Local Authority Gold lurked underneath the conversation?
I'm not sure what he means by that, but asking Mark in the subsequent call to go in and Nicholas accepting it may be construed as he ought to be considering this move, and indeed having Chris Naylor, who was the London Local Authority Gold on the telephone call, may have undoubtedly given the impression to Nicholas that this is something he should be considering.
Yes.
I don't remember if it was specifically mentioned in the call, I have to say.
No. I mean, was it, as it were, the elephant in the room? In other words, an active but unspoken consideration?
I think the process over that afternoon and subsequently on the next day was to encourage softly, maybe too softly, Nicholas Holgate to invoke the London Local Authority Gold arrangements to get the support to stand next to him in what was clearly becoming a complex and difficult recovery.
Yes. I mean, it's the position, isn't it, that if you were not satisfied with his answers to your questions, then you could have invoked London Local.
I can invoke nothing. I have no power, no ability to invoke it. He has to do that himself. And I think part of what you have seen in the previous evidence that's been presented here today is the reassurance being given, it is fine, it is adequate, I don't need this support. I may receive it, but I don't need to bring it in to support me. It is running well. That would imply to me that the invocation of London Local Authority Gold, which has to be done by him, was very unlikely.
Well, let me show you what he told us. Day 273, please, page 118. And on that page at line 18, after the reference to lurking, he says, I mean, if I had either changed my mind by then, or if the answers to the questions had been insufficiently encouraging, then I think I would have expected, and they would have been well within their rights to say, quote, we think you should invoke London Gold. Now, that's what he told us. Was that correct? In other words, you could have said, if you had concerns about his answers, that he should invoke London Gold.
Yes, we could have said that. Any of his colleagues could have said that. I don't recall whether we did or whether we didn't.
Do you accept that you might have given him the impression that you had been reassured by what he was telling you, such that there was no need for him to invoke London Gold?
I'd be surprised, given the nature of the call, with the attendees that were there, individuals being asked or being shoehorned in to go into Kensington and Chelsea, that he would have got the impression that we were encouraging in terms of how the response was going. It would be counterintuitive to believe that to be the case, given what was going on outside of that call in terms of media, public response, and so on.
Do you agree that nobody at that point, in or at the end of the call, envisaged that an escalation in the response being provided by RBKC would happen?
The escalation would come about if there was a recognition that improvements could be made and that additional resource could be put in.
Yes, but nobody, to your...
to my recollection, no, that wasn't.
No, thank you. And then let's go to the post-telephone conference emails, please. Mr. Chairman, while I'm on this, this will take may take 5 minutes or so to cover. I'm in your hands whether we do it now. Let me try and cover it in 5 minutes if we can.
See how you get on.
Here we get on. Now, we've read the précis at GOL 50181. Can we just go back to that, please? you will see in it, under the heading Immediate and Longer Term Support, in the second paragraph, as it were, it says, if requested by the leader of RBKC, London councils may make an approach to political leaders across London to provide political support to RBKC, but it was recognised this is a small network of people able to act in this capacity and a delicate subject. What was that about?
If I recall correctly, this was about support from other leaders in London to the then leader of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea.
Yes, but who were the political leaders and what was the political support being discussed?
This is a summary you'd have to ask Mr. Hetherington for the precise wording. My recollection of that call was we did discuss how the leader of the council was, and London councils, being the representative body of the leaders of the councils themselves, would be the place to ask for support to that leader. It would not be something offered by chief executives, if I can put it that way. That would be for politicians to support other politicians. It is a small network of people, undoubtedly, and it would be a delicate subject of asking one political leader to support another political leader as an officer. I think it has to be recognised there are two very different types of individual here, one political, one officer, which have very different loci. And to ask a politician to support another politician, for that politician to receive that support in a positive way, would be a delicate subject to raise.
Why was it delicate?
Because if you were a political leader, my experience is that an officer telling you needed political support would not be something that would necessarily go down well, or indeed necessarily be supported or accepted without a delicacy in approach.
Can I just ask, have you had experience of this happening on previous occasions?
No, I haven't. I have in subsequent occasions, but not before this, personal experience before this.
Well, if you've had experience subsequently, you may still be able to answer the next question, which is, what form does this political support expected to take?
My expectation would be another political leader in a similar, other borough in London would be speaking to the leader of Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and encouraging them, providing support to them, standing next to them, if I can put it again that way, to give them the support that they would undoubtedly need in coping or dealing with an incident like Grenfell.
But not in a public way?
Not in a public way. That would be almost certainly refused rapidly by the individual concerned, yes.
Thank you.
So, thank you. So it was the problem, which was so delicate, the difficulty with one political leader of one political party political stripe being seen to support a political leader of another party political stripe?
You would need to ask the politicians that. My impression would be it would be presumptive to ask one politician from one party to support another politician from a different party. The better solution would be the same party, bluntly. They're more likely, I would suggest, to accept the support in the manner within which it would be offered.
No, but I'm asking, sorry to bore on about it, but I'm asking you, who was on the call, was the topic that was so difficult, the topic of asking one political leader of one party to support a political leader of another? Was that the problem?
I think it was more, if I recall it, my normal way of dealing with this would be we would need to identify a Conservative leader to support a Conservative leader would seem to be the way to approach this. And of course it would be delicate in making sure that was raised. We'd need to do that in a delicate fashion, not to suggest to someone that they need support.
And was one aspect of the difficulty at that time, being precise, late afternoon on the 14th, a perception growing perhaps that RBKC was not simply responsible for organising the response to the emergency, but involved in its cause? Was that a perception at the time?
Leaving aside this particular statement, it was a perception and was a concern, because clearly the community reaction, I'm sure we'll come back to this later, was such that there was clearly, or beginning to be, clear evidence to me that the community had lost confidence in the council.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment? We are rather in the middle of the aftermath of this discussion, but it's a convenient moment.
Is it convenient to you?
Yes.
I thought you might have some more questions, but it probably is a good time to stop anyway.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Mr. Barradell, we have a break during the morning, and this is apparently the best time to take it. So we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And I have to ask you, while you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it.
Thank you,
All right? Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher, please? Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 12, please. Everybody gonna stop talking? Yes, would you ask Mr. Barradell to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Barradell, ready to carry on?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we then go back to the statement of Chris Naylor, GOL 401603, paragraph 11 on page 5. And in the second bullet point, he says, I sent a text message to John at 1806 asking if he was available to take a call. He replied at 2030 saying he would call when free. And then he says, after 2051, we had a short phone conversation to discuss the outcome of the 1730 conference call, see paragraph 15 below. I asked John, in his capacity as Deputy Chair of LRF, whether he felt there was more I could or should be doing to support Nicholas and the response in RBKC. His view was that my advice in the 1730 meeting had been clear and that Nicholas had acted upon it. He also confirmed that further engagement of LLAG, either in the form of asking for direct support from the duty LLAG or more widely, was at the discretion of RBKC, and that unless or until the stance of RBKC changed, I should remain on standby. But does that accurately reflect the gist of the conversation that occurred between you at that time?
If I recall correctly, yes. Yes, it does.
Yes. And if we go, please, to page 6 of this statement and look at paragraph 13, halfway down that paragraph, it's a long paragraph, he says, and you can pick the words up on the right-hand side of the block of text, my particular concern. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
My particular concern was about the scale of risk in relation to community tension and RBKC's ability to respond to, engage and support the wider community of North Kensington and beyond, their grief, but also their sense of disconnection and anger. This felt systemic and not something that a normal emergency response would be geared up to manage and support. It was not clear one way or the other whether RBKC fully appreciated this risk, but I took some assurance from the fact that this would be a line of inquiry pursued by Mark Sawyer the next morning, see paragraph 15 below, and that as a result of this work a further conversation would take place the next day. Now, that was his concern, and he's explained it there. Did you share that concern yourself?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Was it discussed was it discussed on the call with Nicholas Holgate?
I believe I cannot say yes or no. I can't recall.
Do you remember what your response was to Chris Naylor's question during this call that he's referring to, when he asked whether he could or should be doing more to support Nicholas Holgate and the response at RBKC? Do you remember what you said?
I can't, but it would have been, I would expect it to have been, he made the offer of support to Nicholas at the time, and that would be what I'd expect him to do. And, as it says, remain on standby and await what we would hope would happen.
And is this right, that asking for direct support from the duty LLAG or more widely was at the discretion of Nicholas Holgate?
Absolutely at the discretion of Nicholas.
And was it the case that the role of Mark Sawyer for the next morning was, or at least involved, an assessment of the sufficiency of resources available to RBKC and the adequacy of their response?
In general terms, yes, and I think, as I said before the break, it would also have been the processes and procedures put in place to make sure that that response was structured in a way that would give the best result it could.
And was Mark Sawyer's deployment to RBKC the next morning in anticipation of the potential activation of London Gold?
I think the hope would be that that support would be provided on the activation of London Local Authority Gold. I think it was evident on the 14th in the afternoon that this would be needed at some point, and I think we saw that earlier on.
Yes, I mean, can we put it this way? That Mark Sawyer's the plan to deploy Mark Sawyer the next morning into RBKC was a measure, is this fair, of your scepticism at Nicholas Holgate's response to your questions during the 1730 call?
I think that's a fair summary.
Right. Then let's turn into the 15th of June. Can we please go to your first statement? your first statement, please, at paragraph 31 on page 9, where you say, following extensive discussion of the various issues facing RBKC on this call, it was agreed that both Eleanor Kelly, Chief Executive of the London Borough of Southwark, and I would provide peer support to Mr. Holgate, given that at this stage London Local Authority Gold activation had not been requested by RBKC. Now, is that right? It would be peer support?
Yes.
Yes. Now, there's no reference of peer support in the Hetherington précis, and none recalled by Mark Sawyer in his statement. Are you quite sure that an offer of peer support was made?
I'm pretty certain it was. It would be a natural thing to do, to offer support to a colleague chief executive. Particularly given Eleanor's experience with Lakanal and the Lakanal fire.
And how is it envisaged that peer support would be provided?
On the end of a telephone, the ability to be contacted should there be anything not understood, or that general piece around, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling exhausted, can you please provide me with some support? That would be my meaning of peer support in this context.
Now, before the 5 o'clock, 14th of June teleconference that we've examined already, is it right that you or Eleanor Kelly didn't have any contact with Nicholas Holgate? You've had
not as far as I remember, no.
And the peer support you've just referred to was effectively non-existent up to that point. He was on his own.
Yes. As far as I'm aware, yes, he was.
Right.
But I am aware that a number of chief executives had contacted Nicholas to offer support to him in the period from the fire itself at basically 1 o'clock in the morning through the 5 o'clock when this call took place.
And we've seen the Naylor statement where Naylor recalls that there were some forms of support which had been accepted, but also I think you'll recall maybe that the humanitarian assistance had been offered and provided by London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham.
Some support had been given, yes, is my understanding.
Yes. Now, on the 15th of June, as you confirm in your second statement, is it right, you don't recall carrying out any actions directly relating to the incident before the 5 o'clock meeting that day?
That's my recollection.
And that before that meeting, 5 o'clock on the 15th of June, you didn't speak to, or you don't recall speaking, either to Chris Naylor or to the Mayor of London or his Chief of Staff, David Bellamy, or indeed anyone from central government. Is that right?
That's my recollection, although there may have been contact slightly before 5 o'clock with some of those individuals. It's possible.
Right.
But I don't recall the details, sorry.
Leaving that on one side, then, the shortly before 5 o'clock exception, why didn't you make any contact with the duty LAAG, the Mayor's office, or central government?
I don't recall directly the reason why. I think my expectation would have been Mark was on site assisting Kensington and Chelsea, and that I would have got updates from Mark as to where and what stage they were in, what state they were in at the time.
Did you?
I received an update around about 5 o'clock prior to that meeting. I would have done, yes.
Right, but nothing from the morning till...
No, not in my recollection, no.
And was it the case that you were aware of the concerns being expressed in the media during that day and during the course of that day, and from those who were deployed to RBKC?
The first, yes, I was aware of the increasing media concern, if I can put it that way.
And if we go to your first statement, please, then at page 9, where we're on, and go to paragraph 34, right at the bottom, you say, at 1700 on the 15th June 2017, I joined a conference call with Mr. Holgate, Eleanor Kelly and Mark Sawyer, who was with Nicholas Holgate at Kensington Town Hall. I requested this call, due to the increasing concerns being aired through national media and information received from Deborah Collins, Miss Scott and Mark Sawyer. Now, what information specifically had you received from those named individuals? Can you recall?
So my recollection from Mark was a concern about the manner within which the arrangements were being implemented by Kensington and Chelsea. And if I recall correctly, that was the number of people involved in the calls and the lack of strategic direction that was taking place at Kensington and Chelsea. I don't remember the specifics from the two Southwark officers.
let's go further on in your... No, it's your second statement, forgive me. GOL 401706. Second statement, please, page 12, paragraph 67, where you say there, on the afternoon of the 15th July 2017, I received updates on the status of the response being provided by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea through monitoring national media and information received from Deborah Collins, Miss Scott and Mark Sawyer. Although I have no written record of these updates, from my recollection it indicated that the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea were finding the complexity and scale of the response challenging, and as a result I asked Mark Sawyer to suggest to Nicholas Holgate that he convene a conference call. That's right, is it?
Yes.
Yes. Then if we go, please, to to the Sawyer statement, please, GOL 401349, page 11, paragraph 54, very briefly, he says there, page 11, paragraph 54, however, in my opinion, I did not believe that Nicholas Holgate had complete awareness of the scale and complexity of what the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea were being asked to deal with a lack of full situational awareness across the senior management team. And he goes on to say they hadn't been galvanised as an organisation. Let's also look then at GOL 401301. This is an email sent by Mark Sawyer to himself on the 1st of July 2017 as a note to self and his initial observations. If you look at the bottom of the screen, the penultimate entry, it says, due to continuing concerns on grip, arranged conference call on evening at approx 5:30. Mid-call, Nick left room to speak to someone outside. Now, I've shown you two parts of Mr. Sawyer's evidence. Was this what was being relayed back to you before that afternoon call? Namely, that Nicholas Holgate did not have, so far as Mr. Sawyer could tell, complete awareness of the scale and complexity of what RBKC was being asked to deal with, lack of full situational awareness, and concerns about grip.
That, in my recollection, is the substance of what he reported back, yes.
Let's then turn to the call. We can pick this up at paragraph 76 of Mr. Sawyer's statement, GOL 401349, page 15. We've just looked at that. This is where he suggests the call. And he says in the second sentence, the intention was to allow Nicholas Holgate the opportunity to discuss the status of the response and any additional support the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea may require. So is that correct, that Mark Sawyer had suggested this call himself?
I don't recall, but it would be perfectly reasonable for him to do so.
Right, it wasn't your suggestion?
I can't recall.
Right. So was it the position, just before the 1700 telephone conversation on the 15th of June, that you had formed a view about the ability of RBKC to cope with the humanitarian response and the need for additional assistance?
I think that's a fair summary. And I think that was composed of, as I think I've said, a couple of elements to it. One would have been the feedback, which I'm pretty sure I had from Mark before 5 o'clock, actually, on his impressions of what was going on in KNC. And secondly, from the media and general reporting around at the time.
And had you formed a view that activation of the gold resolution was desirable before that call?
I think I'd partly formed that view on the 14th, actually, in the afternoon.
Notwithstanding what you were told on the 5 o'clock call on that day?
On that day, yes. As I said, I think the scale and the impact of the Grenfell Tower fire was such that it would be counterintuitive not to seek and ask the support of an experienced person or people to stand next to the decision maker at the time. It would make utter sense to me that I would want to have, regardless of experience, someone next to me to be able to assist me, to check my logic, to challenge me on the right decisions that were being taken. It would just seem sensible, if nothing else, to ask for that.
Now,
And sorry, to be clear, because there is no ability to insist on doing so, on invoking the arrangements, because each of the boroughs are sovereign entities themselves, they have the authority, they have the legal power themselves. I think increasingly my view developed over that time to the 15th that we needed to be a little more proactive and insistent that advice and support was given to KNC. But that would require being blunter than is my usual way, as I think comes across. I'm quite measured in terms of what I say, and I needed to be a little more blunt. And again, one of my regrets is I wasn't.
Now, you weren't the duty LLAG. In what capacity were you attending the meeting, if not?
London Local Authority, sorry, the Local Authority panel chair. And frankly, I think to some degree I took it upon myself to make sure this work was being done. A sense of responsibility, a local government responsibility, I suppose, on trying to make sure that the response was better than was being seen.
And what was the formal status of the LAP chair at such a meeting?
I don't believe there actually was a formal status.
We can see that it was
soft power. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. It was soft power being used, if I can put it that way. The degree of encouragement that could be provided to people to do the right thing.
Right. Why was Chris Naylor, who was the primary duty LLAG, not invited to the meeting on the 15th?
I don't recall a particular reason.
Now, it was an important call.
Yes.
Can you explain why there was no agenda for it?
No, I can't explain.
Can you explain why there was no minute or log or note of that meeting?
No, I can't.
You can't, I think, confirm the length of the time of the call.
Not from my recollection.
Would you accept that those features indicated poor practice?
Yes, I do. I think in retrospect I would have made a note, a contemporaneous note of them. Yes, that's absolutely right.
Now, do you know what either you or Mr. Sawyer said to Mr. Holgate at the beginning of the meeting? About why the meeting was being called?
I don't recall.
Do you remember what he said at the beginning of the meeting?
I don't recall.
Do you remember what advice you gave to Mr. Holgate during the meeting?
I don't recall specifics.
I called it a meeting, it was a call, clearly.
Yeah.
Can we go, please, to your first statement, please, page 10, paragraph 35. And you say, in paragraph 35, it was during this call that it became clear to me that further support was needed. How did that become clear to you?
I think from the response, again, of Mr. Holgate and the clear feedback now during the call from Mark Sawyer, that was evident that there was not, and I don't like the phrase, but I think it does summarise it, in general terms, grip being shown by Nicholas Holgate.
And by further support, did you envisage the activation of the London Gold Resolution?
Yes.
And what aspects specifically did you identify at that time from the call, or perhaps from outside the call, that RBKC needed additional support with?
I think the feedback from Mark was a clear part of that. The lack of structure, the size of the meetings, involvement, if I recall correctly, of members of the council, of councillors in some of the meetings. And secondly, the support, again, that was being offered but not grabbed by both hands led me to think this clearly needed a change of direction in leadership. And the only mechanism available would have been the invocation of London Local Authority Gold, and to give very clear, soft direction. You can't direct, let's be very clear, there is no power of direction. It is soft direction. It is standing by and encouraging and really helping the individual to understand the priorities, what needs to be done, what resources are available. There is no mechanism to do it apart from that until 2 o'clock when other events took place, which I'm sure Mr. Willett will come on to.
Yes. During the call, do you recall, was Nicholas Holgate initially reluctant to accept additional support from London Local Authority Gold?
I don't think it was I don't recall specifically, but my impression throughout this was, until indeed the afternoon of the 16th, that there wasn't an understanding of the severity of the problem or the need for additional support, significant additional support at a senior level.
Nicholas Holgate says in his statement, it's paragraph 38 at page 7, we don't need to go to it, that he says, it was my decision, he says, to invoke London Gold in a phone conversation with Jorn Barradell and others on the evening of 15th June. That's what he says in his statement. Yep. Is that correct?
It was his decision. How he arrived at that decision is a different matter, I suspect.
Right, that's really the point. Although he made the decision, was he solely responsible for it, or was he assisted to arrive at that decision?
I think the second is right. He was assisted to. I think, as I said earlier, the need for the activation was growing in my mind. The degree of confidence was decreasing in my mind, and the two, I think, go together. And my recollection is that the participants on that call were quite clear that this would be a good thing to do, and the advice was do it, in far stronger terms than had been the case before.
And can you recall, what was it? What was the trigger point for him arriving at that decision?
You would have to ask him why he changed his mind. I can't recall a specific part of that suddenly he went from not invoking to suddenly invoking. I can't remember a specific point. You would need to ask him.
So you don't recall a specific Damascene
moment in time? No, a Damascene. No, not a Damascene moment.
Well, let's look at his statement, please. Page 8, paragraph 39. This is RBK 3035426. And he says there, at paragraph 39, there is no formal procedure for handover to London Gold, but I was clear that the others on the phone call had also reached the view that Kensington and Chelsea should no longer lead on these responsibilities. Now, he refers there to handover and leading, but from what you could see, leave aside the implications of those words for the moment, was it clear to you on the call that those on the call together had reached the view that K&C should invoke LLAG?
Yes, I think it was very clear, but I really would want to say the language used here is incorrect. When you invoke London Local Authority Gold, it is not transfer of responsibility in that sense, as I said, I think, a few times to try and make sure the inquiry understands it. It is standing next to, it is not standing in the shoes of the individual. So the language used about handover to London Gold, I think, is incorrect. And I think incorrect as well, leading responsibilities are still Kensington and Chelsea's. And that was the case until shortly before 2 o'clock on the next day. They were still responsible. They directed the resource. They received, hopefully, advice under London Local Authority Gold arrangements, but the responsibility was still theirs.
Well, then, in light of that answer, and in light of the language that we can see that that Mr. Holgate uses here, was it, to your recollection and in your mind at the time, was it clear to him that this wasn't a handover, and that if he invoked LLAG Gold, K&C should continue leading?
I don't believe so, because of the circumstances on the next day at lunchtime, which again I'm sure we'll come to, would lead me to think that he did understand that this was not a takeover. It was supporting, and indeed I think some of the documentation later is arriving to support, and it's certainly language I used on the next day, supporting Nicholas Holgate. It was not taking over and running Kensington and Chelsea.
No, that's the next day. What I'm really interested in is the time up to this point. Mm-hmm. To your recollection, from what you could observe, did Nicholas Holgate think, up to this point in time, that by invoking London Local Authority Gold, he was surrendering leadership of the response to the fire to LLAG?
I think there are two. I'm not trying to be difficult. I think there are two parts to that. One is responsibility in the sense of legal responsibility, and the second one is what the impression given would be. And I think one of my trains of thought during the previous days was that some of the behaviours that I saw in terms of refusing advice, not accepting mutual aid, support from other boroughs, was more about how K&C would be perceived by others rather than a cold logic view about what was needed. And I think the language used here gives an indication of the mindset that Nicholas Holgate had on that evening. So the perception was activating would give control to someone else out with Kensington and Chelsea. And that's what this language would seem to me to be implying.
So just to be clear about that, you thought at the time that although he understood that it wasn't surrender, he was concerned not to activate LLAG because it would be seen as such.
I think that you could separate the two with respect. I think the activation of LLAG, I believe, would be perceived, or he perceived as being, let me use the word failure, frankly, in response. And even if it was about handover of responsibility, or even if it was invoking for support, I believe the feeling was, and it is evidenced, I believe, through para 39, that this would be perceived as failure.
Yes, my question really is, was it obvious to you, did it occur to you at the time, that the reason for his not invoking LLAG up to the conversation on the 15th of June at 1700 was because of the perception of surrender?
I believe that, yes. At the time of this, I believe that.
Right.
That was part of the reason why he didn't invoke it, yes.
Now, was the decision that I think you accept and he has said was made during that call to invoke the gold resolution conditional on later decisions, or was it a once-and-for-all decision which had been made?
If my recollection's correct, on that call, he didn't, and I may be incorrect with this, and you may be able to assist me, but I think there were two calls that evening. One was the call at 5 o'clock, and I believe there was one literally subsequent to that, very soon afterwards, when he formally invoked it. But I may be incorrect about that.
Right. Let's look then after 1700 hours at the next thing that happened. If you go, please, to your first statement at paragraph 36, page 10, you say there, I had a call shortly afterwards with John O'Brien, Chief Executive of London Councils, and Eleanor Kelly, Chief Executive of London Borough of Southwark, who was with me in the room. It was on this call that Eleanor Kelly and I set out our concerns to John O'Brien. Following a further series of calls, Nicholas Holgate requested my support, and I therefore arranged to attend Kensington Town Hall on the morning of the 16th of June 2017. Now, just pausing there, what was the purpose in contacting John O'Brien with Eleanor Kelly after the 1700 call, the 5 o'clock call?
If I recall correctly, the issue here was a reluctance to invoke on that 5 o'clock call. And for that to be done would require Nicholas Holgate to request the activation of London Local Authority Gold.
And you say
that would then require me, because I believe that to be the right course of action, to gain support from John O'Brien and London Councils to apply what pressure they could to encourage Kensington and Chelsea to invoke the resolution. And that's why there were two sets of calls. One, the 5 o'clock call, which was the update, if you will, from the staff on scene at Kensington and Chelsea. There was no invocation or call for invocation by Nicholas Holgate at that meeting, and that's why I would have telephoned John O'Brien with Eleanor Kelly to seek support, to encourage again through other means, other people rowing in to support the invocation of that call afterwards. Subsequent to those calls, he invoked it.
So the decision to invoke LLAG Gold was not made on the 1700 call.
Correct. Hence my recollection of 2 calls.
Right. But he says it was.
I think he is mistaken.
Right. So did it work this way? Call with him and others at 1700, discussion. Then there was a second call, the O'Brien-Kelly call shortly after that, and then a further call when the decision was made.
That's my recollection.
I see. Now, let's look at paragraph 36 a little bit more closely. You say, it was on this call, that's the second call, that I set out our concerns to John O'Brien. What were your concerns?
That there was not a request for the invocation of London Local Authority Gold, and the feedback from the officers from Southwark, my recollection of those I don't have, but certainly the feedback from Mark Sawyer on the state of play, if you will, the structures, behaviours, what he observed at meetings, and so on, that I think you heard yesterday from Mr. Sawyer. And those were concerns that I had.
And what was the outcome of your teleconference with John O'Brien?
John, as far as I recall, agreed to support us in changing the response from Nicholas Holgate.
Support you in changing the response? What,
yes.
Leaning on him?
Encouraging. One tries not to lean. I think it's semantics. I think leaning is probably not a bad word to use.
So soft power with a slightly harder edge.
Yeah.
Let's go then to your statement, please, page 10, paragraph 36, where we see you say that Nicholas Holgate, following a further series of calls, Nicholas Holgate requested my support, and that you arranged to go to Kensington. So it looks as if, as I think you've confirmed, it was only after that third call that the decision to activate London Gold was actually taken.
Yes, I believe, yes. Nicholas Holgate changed his view and did activate afterwards, yes.
Right. So, can you remember that third call? We have no record of that call, no documentary record.
I can't. I mean, no.
Who was on that call? Was it just you and him?
I can't recall, actually. It would have been a call to me, since I arranged to go to Kensington Town Hall the next day.
Right. And what did you say to him?
Thank you very much. We'll be there to help next morning.
No. What did you say to him at the beginning of the call? Did you tell him you'd had a private call with Eleanor Kelly and John O'Brien?
I don't recall. I don't recall.
Right. At the beginning of the call, was there still reluctance in some penumbral form from Mr. Holgate to the invocation of London Local Authority Gold?
I don't recall again. I think I was more relieved that he'd agreed to do it, bluntly.
Right. Was there any discussion in that call, or indeed on the first call at 1700, of the various factors that he's told us about, such as the residents' anger, blaming the council for the fire, and the perceived need, as he put it, to deflect that belief from affecting the council's work with survivors?
One of the concerns, if I recall correctly, that was raised was the support being given to the bereaved survivors and the other residents affected. And the focus of this work always had to be, and always should be, and as someone's put it to me, the moral compass here should be for those affected, not about any other consideration. And I think the most concerning thing that I was hearing back on that day was that did not seem to be the case. That the focus, because you would ask for the support you would get from specialists in the field, hadn't been asked for at the time. And that was concerning to the point of, I was going to call it a tipping point, but almost a tipping point in, as you put it, soft power with a harder edge.
You refer there to the moral compass should be for those affected, not about any other consideration.
Yeah.
Was it your perception at the time that the wrong question was being asked, viz., what is the system, as opposed to what do they need?
The question coming from whom?
From Nicholas Holgate.
I believe that Nicholas Holgate had not the understanding of the arrangements and the focus that was needed on the rest centre and the experience from the survivors and the bereaved in the days following the fire. And the first focus should always be there. And I didn't feel it was evidenced by the actions that were not taking place, as seen by Mark Sawyer, even 48 hours after the fire. And again, the media reporting of the experience of survivors and the bereaved would clearly lead me to that conclusion.
Then let's go to John Hetherington's statement, LFB 000611158, page 24. He has evidence to give and has given it on this topic. Page 24, please, paragraph 76. And he says, at 76, at 1839, I had a telephone discussion with Mark Sawyer, who explained the rationale for the intended LLAG activation, and that it was likely to take place the next day, Friday the 16th, after further assessment and with a form of handover between RBKC and the LLAG. Now, is he right that the activation of LLAG would only take place after a further assessment?
No. I think it's in the second part of that sentence that's quite important to look at, and that's in terms of a form of handover between RBKC and the London Local Authority Gold. And that's the degree of assessment. I think the first part is about activate. It would take place the next day, fine. The further assessment and with a form of handover is the one at 2:00.
I'm not sure I understand that.
So,
just break it up.
Right.
First of all, had the decision been made, I think you said yes,
Yep.
but was activation conditional in any way on the further assessment to take place the next day?
No.
So can you account for why Mark Sawyer, for why Mr. Hetherington appears to have been under the impression that a further assessment was necessary?
I think the assessment was to do with the handover. And we've been to that point about the responsibility, the RBKC Gold responsibility being different in the shoes of as opposed to being by the side of. The activation for London Local Authority Gold was to provide the support, as I think I've covered before, as opposed to take the responsibility for the response.
Well, he says in the second line, it was likely to take place the next day after further assessment. Is that correct? What was likely about it as opposed to certain?
You would honestly have to ask him. My understanding at the time, and my activity, if you will, was that London Local Authority Gold had been activated on the 15th, the standing by the shoes of, but there was a difference between that and stepping into the role of being responsible for the response on the 16th.
So the assessment was for what?
Standing in the shoes of, taking over in that sense.
Right. So your evidence is this, and correct me if I'm wrong in summarising it in this way, but that the decision to activate LLAG Gold had been taken. It was going to take place the next day. There was going to be a further assessment, but that wasn't about a handover. That was about the form of support to be given.
You could put it that way, yes.
Well, I have. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, I think it's fair.
That's rather different, though, isn't it, from what Mr. Hetherington says here?
Yes.
Can you explain why there is that difference? I mean, may there have been a misunderstanding between you and him?
It's possible, and I'm not sure I discussed it. He discussed it with Mark Sawyer. Wasn't direct with me. I have to say, I have to say this is extremely unusual set of circumstances where one would go in and take over the responsibility of another chief executive in their own borough for responding to an incident on their borough. I think it was self-evident to me at the time that this required a higher degree of intervention than London Local Authority Gold.
When you talk of intervention, that doesn't sound terribly supportive.
It's supportive, but you intervene to take responsibility, don't you?
Correct. Well, we can argue about that. Let's go back to the facts. GOL 50158, please. Scroll to the bottom of page 1. Email from Charlie Parker at Westminster to you and Eleanor Kelly at 9:42 p.m. Now, Charlie Parker wasn't on the call, or any of the calls, was he?
No.
He says, both just wanted to say well done for getting Nicholas to agree to London Resilience help. I've tried to get him to recognise this is too big for RBKC, and we've offered a wide variety of help, but he hasn't been able to acknowledge that it would be necessary. I fear he doesn't quite understand the implications and wider significance of what's going on. Does that description of Mr. Holgate's approach chime with what you experienced of him up till the evening of the 15th of June?
Yes, it does.
Had you had a similar conversation, like the one which Mr. Parker refers to, in your contact with Mr. Holgate, where you told him this is too big for RBKC?
I'm not sure it was exactly in those terms, but it would have been, as is, I think, evident from the 15th and Mark Sawyer going across, that support would be helpful, it would be useful, it would be needed by him and the borough.
And was there any reason why a firmer line had not been taken up to that point with Nicholas Holgate to get him to see that activation of the gold resolution was in everyone's best interests at an earlier stage?
It was probably my misplaced belief that they were more capable than they were of managing an incident of this scale and understanding what had to be put in place.
While we're on this, can we just look at something late in the evening of the 15th of June? GOL 50382. This is an email right at the very top. Well, in fact, we could pick it up. Forgive me, pick it up in the second email there, halfway down your screen. 15th of June, 2223, from you to Charlie Parker. Thanks and very helpful. Robin C. would be great to have access to. We can speak tomorrow, read this. And then in the foot of the email you say, great to see colleagues stepping up. As you say, scale and complexity enormous. And then there's a further email about a mortuary, and then at the very top, Eleanor Kelly, just to you, at just after midnight, 17 minutes past midnight on the 16th of June. Why do I think he has been stung? Innocent face. What was that about?
You would have to ask her for the precise meaning of that. What I took it to mean was that the conversations on the 5 o'clock and subsequent calls were robust, and he would have been stung. That, I think, again goes to the point that discussed earlier, that another person was going in, and in the end he invoked London Local Authority Gold, and that would have stung him.
Right, so this is about reputation management.
I believe it. That's how I took it to me. That's what I took it to mean.
Right. Then let's move on to the mayoralty. I think it's right that, well, let me ask you, did David Bellamy, who was Chief of Staff to the Mayor of London, telephone you as the chair of the LAP on that evening?
I believe he did, with some concerns on what the GLA, or sorry, the Mayor's office, had seen at the Westway Centre. Yes,
and I'll just show you his statement to the inquiry at MOL 6025, paragraph 79. And it's at page 16, forgive me. Page 16, paragraph 79. He says, after the reference to the second ministerial meeting in the afternoon of that day, he goes on to say, following the meeting, I was sufficiently concerned at the lack of progress being made with the recovery operation that on my return to City Hall, I telephoned Jorn Barradell, Chief Executive of the City of London Corporation and Chair of the Local Authority Panel, LAP, to inquire about the progress of the recovery operation from his standpoint and discuss what action could most helpfully be taken. And then 4 lines up from the foot of the paragraph, he continues, I was informed by Mr. Barradell that he was currently on a separate call with RBKC, who had informed him that they were planning to invoke mutual aid that evening. I was reassured by this. However, this did not in fact take place until the following day. Now, making allowances for timing, do you remember telling the Mayor's office, David Bellamy in particular, that you had been told by RBKC that they were planning to invoke mutual aid that evening?
As far as I recall, yes.
And at what point in the afternoon or evening would that have been?
I believe the call with David Bellamy was later than the 5 o'clock set of calls. My memory is correct.
But it must have been presumably later than the second call you had with Nicholas Holgate after the
where he agreed
call.
to invoke, yes.
So that would have been at what time?
I honestly can't recall. I mean, you need to look back.
Right. Was it the case that political and public pressure at that stage was such that you realised at the very least that activation of London Gold was an imperative now?
I think that's a fair point, yes.
Let's then look into the timing a bit further. GOL 50s196. Yes, this is an email at 1920, if you go to the foot of the screen, 3/4 of the way down, from David Bellamy to you, feedback on K&C. Hi, John, thanks for your time earlier. Below is the feedback I've received from the team here so far. If I get any more, I'll pass it on. Best wishes, David. Now, the time earlier, that must refer to the telephone call, yes?
Yes.
So can we bound that telephone call as taking place before this email at 7:20 in the evening?
That would make sense, yes.
So does that tell us that your call at 5 o'clock and your 2 subsequent calls happened before then?
Yes. It would yes. Yeah.
So would the sequence of events be 5 o'clock call with Holgate, second call with Kelly and O'Brien, third call with Holgate again, and then fourth call with David Bellamy?
I'm sure there were more calls than that, but the sequence of these particular ones would make sense.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, let's look at the substance. Underneath it, first asterisk, he says, clearer communication to the public on what they should and shouldn't do, regular updates, just putting times on their website when they update would help, and their Twitter updates have been a bit sporadic. Latest update on their website is 11:34. And the second point, improved responsiveness to key agencies so we can help, especially to London Resilience, who are attempting to coordinate for them. Just on that second point, what did you understand that to mean?
I understood that to be the request for mutual aid for support, and also the information going through the London Local Authority Coordinating Centre and support they were able to offer.
Right. And then third point, over the page, top of the screen, British Red Cross have been struggling to get traction with them. I've been helping here, but they have lots of experience they could lean on. Was that something that you knew about before then, that British Red Cross have been struggling to get traction with RBKC?
I'm not sure if I did know it before then, specifically about the British Red Cross.
And then the fifth point is about lack of communication, to the penultimate point there. He goes on to say, e.g., those who have been evacuated nearby don't know when they will be allowed back. Was that something that you knew before this call or this email?
No, not as far as I recall, no.
So you hadn't discussed that with Nicholas Holgate?
I don't believe so.
Had you received feedback to that effect from the LLAG communications team that I think by then, is this right, had been temporarily seconded into RBKC?
The second part I'm not sure of, and I don't recall that. The point around corporates and VIPs was I was aware of a number of offers that had been made by organisations, by private sector organisations, that did not receive an open, armed welcome from RBKC, and the communication back to them was not strong.
Now, we've heard evidence from Nicholas Holgate and from you that at a point in the evening, early evening of the 15th of June, the decision was taken to activate LLAG. Why was it decided that the activation would not in fact take place until 2 o'clock the next day, 16th of June?
It's not. If I really need to be clear about this, London Local Authority Gold is not the 2 o'clock time slot. That is the point at which I walked into Nicholas's shoes and chaired the gold meetings in RBKC and the other London-wide meetings. It's very different from being London Local Authority Gold at that point. Nicholas was still chairing those gold meetings until the 2 o'clock one. And I think the gold meeting, if I'm right, on the 16th in the morning was chaired by Nicholas, and I believe I was introduced at the time, but again, my memory not being what it ought to be, on some of these things it would be in the evidence somewhere, is Nicholas Holgate chaired that, and I was with him introduced to the meeting to support Nicholas Holgate. The meetings from the 2 o'clock onwards, I chaired, and indeed we moved, as no doubt you'll come to later, we moved those meetings and the support centre across to Westminster. So I can't iterate enough how important that distinction is, just to understand the process that was gone through and the lack of any bluntly legal framework to do that from a local authority point of view. There was no facility to activate the London Local Authority Gold arrangement, or indeed to stand in Nicholas's shoes without him asking me to do so.
So your evidence is that the only significance of 2 o'clock on the 16th of June was that you chaired the gold meeting.
It was incredibly significant because it's the point at which I assume responsibility for the response to Grenfell Tower and am able then personally to call upon agencies of government to structure the response as I saw was needed to be done. That was only available to me at 2 o'clock once Nicholas Holgate had stepped back and said, would you please now take responsibility for the recovery, for the response
Well,
for
Mr.
Grenfell Tower.
Forgive me, Mr. Barradell. I don't want to go over old ground, but maybe I misunderstood something. But in that answer, and indeed the last one, you have emphasised the fact that once 2 o'clock came, Nicholas Holgate was stepping back, and you were now taking responsibility for the response to the fire. How is that consistent with the outcome of an invocation of LLAG Gold being support?
Because the two are very different.
Well,
London Local Authority.
and that's the point.
Sorry, in that case, we are violently agreeing. But the importance here is London Local Authority Gold was Nicholas Holgate's gift, as it were, to do, as indeed the 2 o'clock one was, stepping into the responsibility for Grenfell and the response.
See if you can help me with this, Mr. Barradell. I do understand all you've said about how London Authority Gold is simply to provide support. You've now talked about taking over, to use that expression, from Mr. Holgate on the 16th of June. It sounds to me as though at that point you stepped outside the gold arrangements.
Correct.
Into something which was unplanned and unprecedented.
I think the second word I would say is absolutely right. It was unprecedented. It hadn't happened, in my knowledge, before. It relied upon, if you will, the London Local Authority Gold arrangement in its construct to say you can spend the money, and it became treated, as if it was an incident that crossed borough boundaries, if you will, and therefore you could invoke and use the London Local Authority Gold in that sense to use the spending and the coordination. But it absolutely was unprecedented, yes, I agree.
And from then on, you weren't really working under the gold resolution unless you were spending money under,
I think that's
under what that does provide for. You were working on some other basis.
That on the invitation of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea to do so, yes.
Right. Yes, thank you.
If that helps, exactly. So that's exactly what I'm trying to be clear about.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Right. So, at the end of the 15th of June, the position was that the arrangements, and correct me if this is wrong, I just need to make sure we've understood it through you. The arrangements contemplated by the London Gold Resolution had been activated by Mr. Holgate.
Yes.
At that stage, was it contemplated that you would do the unprecedented, as you've just explained to the chairman?
In my mind, I think I was becoming convinced that the response of Kensington and Chelsea was insufficient to provide what was needed by the communities, by the survivors, by the bereaved, and by the community in Kensington and Chelsea. And that it would need something more structured, and the intervention, and I use the word advisedly in this sense, to be unprecedented to grip the response.
Well, there's unprecedented but formalised in an existing structure, and there's unprecedented and not contemplated by the existing structure. What was it that had happened at 2 o'clock? Was it the former or the latter?
I think it was the final realisation that by Nicholas Holgate that this was not his area of expertise, that it needed expertise to be given the chance to direct and ensure the response was improved, and that other parties present, which are central government, would wish this to be the case as well. And the support of central government in that intervention was, I believe, quite clear and key to that taking place.
Well, let's take this in stages, but I think the answer is that, is this right? And by way of an outcome, by 2 o'clock, you had come to the conclusion that even the LLAG arrangements were insufficient for the purpose.
Yes. Yes.
So something new and radical had to be done.
Yes.
I see. Well, let's then pull it back in time a little bit and start with a run into that back in the evening of the 15th of June. Can we please go to LFB 3061240 and see if this helps? It may not. This is why I'm putting it to you. This is an email from John Hetherington to Toby Gould, Hamish Cameron and Matt Hogan. So this is internal to London Resilience. And it's at 22:04 on that evening. And if we go straight to the middle of the email, he says this: LLAG activation. This will not take place before 1300, most likely. John B will go to RBKC to see what he is signing up to before he officially activates LLAG. Mark is currently in RBKC trying to help them set out their stall. My take on this, spoken briefly to Hamish, we can use this to show a support to mutual aid through the LLACC and potentially reduce commitment to recovery and HA. Mark's requests of us have diminished now that he has spent a day in RBKC and understands the frustrations and the dangers of getting embroiled in sorting out a larger number of problems for them. Now, was it the case, as a fact, that you were going to RBKC to see what you were signing up for before you officially activated LLAG?
No, I don't believe so, because for the reason I've said, I took the activation to be standing by Nicholas's side to support him during that time as chairing the SCG, the recovery groups, the RBKC Gold.
Did you have any discussions with London Resilience, whether it was Toby Gould or any of the others on this email, about the outcome of your discussions with Nicholas Holgate?
I don't recall. I don't recall whether I had or not.
Right. Are you able to explain how it comes about that Mr. Hetherington thought that activation would not happen before 1 o'clock the next day?
I can only assume he thought it was taking responsibility for the incident in some form or another. That's all I can explain with that.
Why would he have, if he had understood the London Gold arrangements in the same way as you, why would he think at that stage, on the evening of the 15th of June, that you would be taking responsibility for the incident as opposed to providing mere support?
I don't know. But my belief at the time was that Nicholas Holgate was still sitting in the gold chair, in the chair to do that, until the point at which it was agreed that he would step aside and ask me to take over. And I think there were two separate pieces here. One was his understanding and my belief that the London Local Authority Gold activation, in the sense of an individual authority, not a group of authorities, took place when he said, I'd like to activate that role, and the separate one at 2:00 or thereabouts on the following day. And sorry, I'm not going to say this is nomenclature. I would need to have that, or you would need to have that conversation with John Hetherington as his understanding for that. Well, I think in some senses, the London Local Authority Gold activation in that sense was to provide the support to Nicholas Holgate. The second part was taking over the responsibility for the response for the Grenfell Tower.
Was there any sense in which you were holding your hand in acting, in whatever capacity, before satisfying yourself of what it was you were, as it were, signing up to?
No. I think it's fair to say with this that I walked forward to try and offer the support and what knowledge I had in helping here.
Now, let's go to the transcript of Nicholas Holgate's evidence at day 273, page 187. He says at line 17, at line 17, he says, I would describe it slightly differently. I think that it was his, that's yours, to assume when he chose to do so from any time from the Thursday evening phone call onwards, and my interpretation of the delay, from what I saw as a delay, from Thursday evening to Friday lunchtime, is that he thought he would do a better job as London Gold via a period of observation first than, in a sense, leaping in and having to cover both operational short-term decisions, while at the same time as doing what he... If we could turn the page, please. What he had done by the Saturday morning, which is design a very significant management structure for running the Grenfell Fire Recovery Task Force, or whatever it was called. Are we to take it from the evidence you've given us this morning that your impression of what you were doing and his impression of what you were doing was rather different?
It would appear so. I think the impact that I would go back to what actually happened at the time, which was Nicholas Holgate was still chairing those meetings on the Friday morning. I was present. I was observing in that sense and offering advice, but he was still chairing those meetings. The reason for that was to do with, in my estimation, was to do with the activation of London Local Authority Gold, and my role here was to advise and support him, not to take over, because I had no authority to do so. If his belief was he activated on Friday, and his belief was that it was then my responsibility, that would not explain some of his actions the next day. If it was an error in that sense, the error was mine of not explaining explicitly what I believed I was doing. In other words, I was not taking over. He was still I didn't assume the responsibility, and the error was probably mine of not explaining that explicitly to him. I think that goes to the point of the different situation we were in here with an individual borough not activating, not asking for the support, not asking for mutual aid over a significant period of time, which raised the concern, my concern certainly, as to their capability and ability to do this. And frankly, understanding as well that the structures that they put in place were not coping with the demands being placed upon them.
So does it come to this? But you and Nicholas Holgate, and perhaps London Resilience as well, were on the one hand, and you on the other, were at cross purposes. They thought that you had activated London Gold, but were waiting to undergo a period of observation to satisfy yourself what you were stepping into, and then did so at 2:00. taking over, but acting as London Gold. But your understanding was that you'd activated London Gold, was performing that role during the morning of the 16th, and then at 2 o'clock stepped outside the London Gold arrangements into a brave new world, unprovided for by the structure.
It is, I think, evidently from as you've described it, and from the evidence here, from what people have said, clearly there was a difference of understanding of what was going on. I would, though, bring to light the evidence from a government official who was present on the Friday, and what she says. This is Joe Farrer, who I believe has provided a statement to the inquiry as to what Joe Farrer believed to be the case as well.
So, is that what made the difference, or contributed to the?
It contributed to the different stance that was being taken. Yes.
Can you just clarify one rather small point for me? My understanding was that the London Gold arrangements gave rise to a rota for chief executives, and we've seen reference to the chief executive who was on and then going off and so on and so forth. You weren't actually due to be Gold, were you?
No.
So how did you assume the position of Gold?
So I think there was a series of conversations that took place over the previous few days. If you remember back at that time, we'd had a general election, we'd had a terrorist attack, we'd had an increase on London Bridge and Westminster Bridge Borough Market, we'd had an increase in the terrorism alert the terrorism status from significant or substantial, to severe, which is the first one we'd had of that type. And we had, following the takeover, admittedly following Finsbury Park Mosque, a series of incidents have been taking place during the period of the Grenfell Tower fire. And the prudent thing to do would be to reserve the two chief executives, the primary and the secondary, for any other incidents that would occur in London, and effectively treat this as a separate contained incident where other chief executives could support. The resolution allows London Local Authority Gold as defined. So in that sense, I stepped into that role and therefore had the resolution support behind.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, it was predominantly to do with the management of potential risk in London here and keeping other chiefs available for those events should they happen.
Right. Thank you very much. And presumably, when you went along to the meeting in your role as Gold on the morning of went to Kensington on the 16th, you were expecting to continue in the role of providing support?
I think in my mind, as I think I alluded to earlier, it was clear to me that the organisation would not be able to manage the response, the aftermath of Grenfell Tower, in a way that was appropriate for and focused on the survivors, bereaved, and the community. Now, that's where I went. And when I went to Kensington, that was in my mind. What I had to do was get to a place, and this is why I focused on this a little bit. I had to get to a place where I was asked to assume the responsibility of Kensington and Chelsea Gold by Nicholas Holgate and by the borough.
So that was already in your mind?
In my mind, it was the outcome that I believed had to happen.
I see. All right. Thank you very much.
But it's not an outcome that was provided for by the civil contingency structure in London, is it?
It isn't, and that's why it was unprecedented and why Nicholas Holgate and the borough had to ask me to act in loco parentis, or my Latin's very bad, but in terms of being the person as K&C in that sense.
Yeah. And you didn't have any qualms about his authority to delegate to that extent?
It had, as long as it had the support of the political leadership of Kensington and Chelsea and the support of government to do so. And the government...
Why did the government come in?
That was because I knew that I would be asking for significant support from central government, not in terms necessarily of cash, but of people across government departments, DWP, Home Office and so on, to be able to respond to the community needs better, bluntly. They were a key partner in this, again, not necessarily precedented in the past, but certainly would be needed to help respond to this.
Right.
Good. Thank you.
Yes. Let's go then to, if we can, please, to the morning of the 16th of June. You attended the town hall, I think, at 10 o'clock and went to the Council Gold group meeting at that stage. Yes?
I may have arrived a little bit earlier. If my recollection's right, I had to wait a little bit in the reception area to get access into the building. But yes, so the first meeting would have been at 10 o'clock.
Yes. And what was your observation of the Council's organisation of the response from that meeting?
If my recollection's right, for a meeting that was supposed to be strategic, it felt extremely operational, by which I mean it was going into details of numbers of this, numbers of that, not taking a holistic and an overview. There were also, if my memory is right, a significant number of people in the room. I mean, I think I'm talking here of 15 to 20 people in the room.
Let's go to GOL 50161, please, which is the minutes of the meeting. And you could see who was present there from the top of the page. And if we go, please, to page 4, under LLAG, you could see Local Authority Gold. There's a bullet point. JB outlined what he and his team would be doing, which is primarily to complement what we are doing and give us some respite. He praised the council for managing on their own for so long, but now was the time to get in, help and support. Did you say that?
I believe I did, yes.
And what did you outline at the meeting that you and your team would be doing?
It would be providing additional staff to help complement what they were doing themselves. It's consistent in my view with what we would be doing as London Local Authority Gold in these circumstances, coordinating additional support, giving the staff who were working very hard, actually, some respite and support.
Now, if you look just above the title, London Local Authority Gold, you'll see a little bullet point which says, Jorn Barradell JB asked MF to ensure flow of information goes to staff on the front. What was the background to your raising that?
I believe there were the concern, I think David Bellamy the night before had sent an email where there was concern about knowledge and frontline staff and visibility of managers and senior staff, and I believe that was referring to that. Lack of information from the centre being available at the rest centres and so on.
So it was the David Bellamy email at
I think that was a trigger for that, yes, among others, but it was certainly in the Bellamy email. And
that's the one we've seen? With the asterisks that I showed you.
Yes.
GOL 50196.
Yes.
Right. Let's then move to something you've just referred to, which is the appearance on the scene of Dr. Jo Farrer.
Yep.
Yes. Now, taking a step back, she was, I think, at this time, 16th of June 2017, the Director General for Local Government and Public Services.
I believe so. Yes.
At the MHCLG. Yes. Yes, and she says in her statement to the inquiry that she saw you and spoke to you in Nicholas Holgate's offices on that day, the 16th of June 2017. Do you recall that meeting?
I don't recall the specifics. I know I met Jo that day.
Would it have been in the morning of that day?
I honestly can't recall.
Would it have been after the local gold meeting that we've just seen the minutes for?
It's likely. Yes, because when I arrived at Kensington, as I said, there was a slight delay in getting into the office, but I believe I spoke to Nicholas Holgate first.
Right.
Therefore, the timing would suggest it was after the 10 o'clock meeting.
Let's then go to her statement to the inquiry. CLG 3030414, please, page 16, paragraph 78. At the foot of the screen. She says this: I went to see Nicholas Holgate as planned and was surprised that he was not available to see me. I had to wait for some time. When I was shown to his office, Jorn Barradell was present and in discussion with Nicholas Holgate. My recollection is that John stated he was there to support Nicholas Holgate and that there would be a chief executive rota as part of the London resilience arrangements. I did not think this sounded sensible and felt we needed an experienced person to be in the lead rather than in support. Do you recall first saying that you were there to support Nicholas Holgate?
That's consistent with my interpretation of the London Local Authority Gold role.
Yeah, but do you recall it?
The specifics of the meeting I can't.
When she says that I did not think this sounded sensible and felt that we needed an experienced person to be in the lead rather than support, did she say that?
I can't recall if she. I presume she did if it's in her statement. I don't know. Can't recall.
Now, if we turn the page, please, to page 79, paragraph 79, page 17, she says, I therefore had a private discussion with Jorn Barradell to ask if he would take over the local authority gold role on a permanent basis. He agreed in principle. Do you recall that?
Yes.
You do. And what did you understand her to mean when she invited you to take over the local authority gold role on a permanent basis? What did you understand her to be implying or expressing?
That was being the RBKC gold role. It was stepping into the shoes of Nicholas Holgate, chairing the various meetings, chairing the gold meetings, for an example.
And in doing that, did you understand that you would be, in effect, RBKC?
Not all of it, only that part of it responding to the incident on their borough.
And that in acting, you were acting within the powers and with the responsibility and authority of the chief executive?
Of the council, yes.
Of the council.
The responsibility for the response to the Grenfell Grenfell Tower fire was the council's responsibility.
So you were basically becoming the individual at the Category 1 responder, directing and being responsible for that Category 1 responder's response.
That is a summary of what I felt that was the role at the time, yeah.
I see.
And can I just ask, had you had any contact with the council in any manifestation by that time?
I believe only Nicholas Holgate.
Well, he's not the council, is he? He's the chief executive.
I don't recall one with the leader of the council, no. Not that I recall. No. I take it you mean the political side.
Well, I was thinking of whoever it is who speaks on behalf of the council or who can take decisions on behalf of the council.
The chief executive can take decisions on behalf of the council through delegated authority from the council in full council, so they do have the power to do that. Depends on the delegations given to the chief executive by the council, but it would be normal that they could delegate the responsibility, for an example, to chair and coordinate response to an individual that they choose. That would be normal practice.
Right. Well, let's just look and see what Jo Farrer's recollection is. She says that she then spoke to John O'Brien, Chief Executive of London Councils. He agreed to assist in facilitating this arrangement. Nicholas Holgate agreed to this course and stepped down from the role. Was John O'Brien present at this meeting?
I don't think so, but I couldn't say one way or the other.
Right.
I don't believe he was.
Do you recall what Nicholas Holgate said or did in agreeing to this course and stepping down from the role?
No, but simply that. I don't recall the specifics of the conversation, no.
Right. Who was it who appointed you into the role of RBKC Gold?
Nicholas stepping down and asked me to do it.
So he appointed you to take his place?
Yes.
Did you investigate whether he had the power to do that?
I assumed that he had asked his political leadership. Part of the conversation with John O'Brien would have been, this is happening, for him to understand that. But no, I didn't specifically ask him what authority he had to do that. I took this at that stage, from an RBKC point of view, as stepping forward to assist and chairing the RBKC meetings, and Nicholas agreeing for that to be the case, and attending the meetings himself as well. Yeah.
So summarising it perhaps, can we pinpoint your agreement to step into the role previously occupied by Nicholas Holgate in the response to this discussion with Dr. Jo Farrer on perhaps the late morning of the 16th of June?
This was a point in time when Nicholas asked me to do that role.
Right. Now, I think it's also the case that you updated Melanie Dawes, Permanent Secretary at the MHCLG, later that evening. Yes?
I believe I spoke to her later that day, yeah.
Yes. Now let's go to CAB 402932 to see if we can assist with your recollection on this topic. This is an email from, I'm afraid it's a bit small, but we may be able to expand it if we can. It's an email from Melanie Dawes to Mark Sedwill on the 16th of June 2017 at 2026. He was the then National Security Advisor, I think, and you were not copied into it, but it refers to her contact with you. And let me show you what she says. Mark, I know the PM has been very concerned about Kensington and Chelsea's capacity today. As I said in the margins of Cobra, Jorn Barradell took over at lunchtime as Gold Command for the whole recovery, and he has just rung me with an update. He has clearly made very significant progress this afternoon, and I think we can now be assured that the situation is coming under proper control. The key points: he has taken over the entire recovery operation. Parallel teams to the KNC ones are now in place on all fronts, including housing. They finally have shift patterns in place. And then it goes on, 4 lines down. John has brought, or 4 bullet points down, John has brought in heavyweight leadership alongside him. 3 serving chief executives are acting as his deputies: Southwark, Hounslow and Bromley. And it goes on in detail. First, had you told her that you had made very significant progress?
I think I would not presume to say that. What I would have said to her is, these are the actions that have taken place. This is what I've done in the period between lunchtime and when I spoke to her.
Yes.
At 8:30.
Right. I mean, what I've read to you so far, is that consistent with your recollection of what you had done?
Yes.
Yes.
Plus a few other things, yes.
Yes, and some other things are in there as well, and I haven't read it all to you. And then she goes on, after the bullet points, as follows. On KNC itself, John is clear that they are in a bad way. At official level, the gold structure manages this risk for the time being. It has basically taken over. At political level, other London councils are coming in with support. After the immediate crisis is over, we will clearly need to consider a long-term solution. Now, when she says it has basically taken over, that's correct, isn't it, I think?
For the response to the Grenfell Tower fire, yes.
Yes, not taken over the council, no.
Just to be really clear, yes.
Yes, but that was not a result, I think you now tell us, as a result of the invocation of the gold arrangements. It was subsequent to that and novel.
Correct.
Yes. And on your assessment of RBKC, did you tell her that it was in a bad way?
Yes.
What was that? What was it about the council that was in a bad way?
We have moved from lunchtime to 8:20. In the intervening period, a series of events happened, one of which was the demonstration within the town hall. That demonstrated to me firsthand the fragility of the leadership team in KNC after working all hours, bluntly, between the fire and then. And that's what I was talking about in a bad way. The staff were very tired. They had worked incredibly hard, continuously actually from the fire. And one thing, if I can make clear, Mr. Chairman, the comments I'm making are in no way about the staff, individual staff who did go above and beyond and worked incredibly long hours. But the structure and the way of working was my comment, to be really clear about this. And the KNC in a bad way, where the organisation itself and the staff within it, having worked that way, I saw firsthand during the demonstration how fragile that was.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Barradell, that's the time we should stop so we can all have some lunch. So we'll break there. We'll resume, please, at 2:00. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 2:00, please.